a particular pleasure to welcome two former clerks of this House, one clerk of the House, former clerk of the House, and another former clerk of this committee. And I have counselled our committee staff to hold back no ambitions because of where they might finish up. But thank you both for being with us, and I will kick off straight away with my first question, and hoping that we can ask our questions crisply and you could give your answers as directly as you can. We'd be very grateful. So, Dr. Seawood, you're an authority on these matters. Historically, what has been the role and functions of the Speaker of the House of Commons, and what has significantly changed in its role in recent years?
Well, obviously, Chairman, that's a very wide question, and I'll try to answer it as quickly as possible using the sort of generally used division between the sort of representative function and as presiding officer and as administrator. I think the origins of the role lie in that representative function as a spokesperson for the Commons in its relationship with the Lords and with the Crown. What you might actually call a rapporteur these days, a sort of spokesperson to convey the decisions of this body. I think it brings with it a sense of being a representative of a corporate entity, of the Commons as a corporate entity. And this is sort of the 14th, 15th century origins of the role, upholding the dignity and power of the Commons, engaging in issues of privilege and so on. I think some of those things have fallen away. Privilege now is a major preoccupation in certain respects, but not in the sense that it was then. And that sort of sense of a corporate interest, I think, has interestingly died away as party came to dominate. You could say there's been a change more recently in that representative role, in that the Commons has started to have a more significant interest in representing itself as a corporate body. You could look at speakers over the last 20 years and there's sort of considerable expansion of the public engagement role, and I think that's something we'll probably come back to. Secondly, as presiding officer, being a spokesperson draws with it one of the roles that we might recognise as being that of the chair in many other contexts. Indeed, in its early history, you'd probably see the Speaker actually acting as much more conventional chair than our Speaker as he or she is now, actually sort of trying to make up the mind of the House collectively, trying to sort out its sort of inchoate thoughts into a debatable, votable question. That sort of ceases by the 17th century when MPs rather decide that it would be an awful lot better for them if they were to simply bring their own question and say, here it is, Mr. Speaker, this is what we want to vote on. Organiser of debates. The House is in its origins largely self-regulating. I think if you want to know what the House of Commons was like before the sort of end of the 18th century, it's quite interesting to look at the way the House of Lords runs itself now. I mean, possibly not quite so much now as it was 20 years ago, but it's very much a self-regulating body, and the Speaker is there to hold the ring rather than to organise. But increasingly that changes as well, particularly with Speakers' lists of speakers in debates and so on. The Speaker's role of actually choosing who to call to speak is probably a sort of 17th century role. Referee. The idea that the Speaker is there to enforce the rules of the House is something that is a sort of 16th, 17th century development, and that's when you start to get speakers being trained lawyers as a matter of routine. Some speakers in the sort of 17th century are expected really to go on to high judicial office. But I think there's a major change in the way that the Speaker works in the late 19th century as the rules become more elaborate, as standing orders become more fixed. The House gains a full set of standing orders which governs most of its proceedings in the from the 1880s onwards. Really, the whole rush of standing orders from the 1880s means that the Speaker's role starts to change into being more of a gatekeeper. He's the one who decides who gets to do certain things, and I think that's a very critical change. Things like the selection of amendments, of course, comes in 1909, what used to be called the kangaroo closure. And then finally, thirdly, as administrator, that role is a very small one to start with. It's only really in the early 19th century that the Speaker becomes, in any sense, an administrator. The 1812 House of Commons Commission Act, House of Commons Offices Act, actually, I think it's called, is the sort of starting point for the House being in control, in some sense, of its own proceedings. And Speaker Abbott, 1802 to 1817, is a sort of major reformer in that respect. And of course, but even then, it's not until 1978, when you get the House of Commons Commission and so on, that you get a significant change of that. I'll stop there, Chairman. I'm sure that's raised enough hairs running.
Thank you. I won't follow up. Who's next? It's David Morris.
Lord Lisvane, Erskine May identifies being the representative of the House, the presiding officer and the administrative duties as the three functions of the Speaker. How do you understand the Speaker's role in these regards, and in your view, has the role of the Speaker changed in recent years?
I think the first two have changed not substantially or spectacularly. Clearly they develop as parliamentary practice and culture develops, and the Speaker, the Speakership, I should say, reacts to that. The administrative, the third of your titles, that has changed very substantially. And it is my view, and has been for a long time, the Speaker should not chair the House of Commons Commission. That should be a member elected by the House, but to that separate function. And ideally, of course, that should be a member used to running something big. Of course, the Clerk of the House is the Chief Executive, but the Speaker is the Chairman of the Board, so to speak. And if you have a Speaker who has never run anything, then that role becomes a sort of work experience, which is not good for the House and not good for the structures, I think. So I would put that footnote onto your third activity.
To what extent are the differing functions of the Speaker complementary or conflicting?
I think circumstances can always alter cases. I don't think they need to be conflicting. They ought to be complementary, and I think it will be, hard cases make bad law. I can't really envisage circumstances where they conflict. That is not to say, of course, that in any of those roles there aren't extremely spiky and contentious problems to solve.
But the Speaker might have to recuse himself from something if he is personally involved in it.
Well, I think that is a normal expectation in parliamentary culture. You can't be a judge in your own cause.
Thank you. David Jones?
Yes, Dr. Seawood, in historical terms, what has been the significance of the role of the Speaker in the relationship between the government and the House?
Yes, obviously it's the key element of the role, particularly in its early history. I think I'd go back to what I said at the beginning, that there's an important sense right at the beginning of the speakership that the House is a corporate entity, and it's the role of the Speaker to represent it in its dealings with other corporate entities such as the Crown. So it's supposed to protect the House's privileges, to protect the right of the House to operate independently. The House of Commons has always been hostile to speakers who it suspected was failing to do that, was too close to the Crown, misrepresenting it, all of those sort of things. I think there's another side to that, which is that there was even in the early years of the House of Commons, right through until perhaps the early 19th century, as almost a tradition of deference to the Crown that exists. It's sort of understood from the 15th century, if not before, that the speakership will normally be proposed by the speaker will normally be proposed by the Crown. It will be a Crown nominee, and there's an expectation that this will be a difficult role for the speaker because they are, in a sense, in a strong relationship with both the House of Commons and with the King or Queen. Indeed, in some ways, they're sort of beholden to the Crown. When speakers have been lawyers, they've traditionally used it as a stepping stone to high judicial office. So, if you expect to be Lord Chief Justice, you're going to keep your nose fairly clean as you go on. Francis Bacon or Sir Edward Coke are the sort of famous examples. It's sometimes assumed that Arthur Onslow creates this sort of tradition of impartiality in the mid-18th century. Onslow, speaker from 1728 to 61, and enormity still hasn't been surpassed for the length of his speakership. And he goes on about impartiality in a way that I think no speaker has previously gone on. He's sort of he holds the idea that he is there to be impartial very strongly. On the other hand, he's very close to Walpole, and other speakers since have been very close to ministers. And I suppose that sort of difficulty in the speakership always has continued because speakers have really traditionally almost always been members of the majority party when they've been elected. So there's always a lasting relationship there which has potentially been difficult. Yeah.
Right. And Lord Lisbane, what has been the more recent role of speakers in the relationship between government and the House?
I think there are always areas of potential disagreement on expenditure, for example. The proposal for restoration and renewal is an area inevitably of contention given its size. I'm not saying that there is disagreement, but these are areas where the government with the purse strings, despite, of course, the House of Commons' authority over finance, and the requirements of Parliament may have anfractuosities between them. I think the stakes are slightly raised in an atmosphere of minority government. I remember the minority government in 1974 when one went into standing committee meetings with absolutely no clue as to what was going to emerge at the end of it. And functions like the selection of amendments, for example, become more important in those circumstances. The process of selection is the same, but if you have a government with a very large majority, then the outcome is likely to be academic. If you're dealing with amendments which, if selected, may well be approved by the House, then, as I say, that raises the stakes.
And to what extent is the role of the Speaker to act as an advocate for the House in relation to the government?
In an ideal world, I think the role of the Speaker in that is complementary to that of the Leader of the House, who classically is described as the representative of the House to the government and the government to the House. And I think a good working relationship between the two is very important in that respect. But being an advocate to the government, I think, is simply a subset of a much wider role which an effective Speaker plays, which is being an advocate for Parliament, and particularly for the House of Commons as a whole. And we may come on, perhaps, Chair, we may come on to this later in terms of what might be priorities for an incoming Speaker.
Would you say that it's the role of the Speaker to enforce the will of the House? And if it is, would you say that the Speaker currently has sufficient powers to do so?
The classic enforcing the will of the House goes back to Speaker Brand on the 3rd of February 1881, when the House had been debating a motion to bring in, wasn't even second reading, to bring in the Protection of Person and Property Ireland Bill. And it was being serially obstructed by the Home Rulers. And Brand simply invented the closure on the spot. And there he was interpreting the will of the House. I think the next morning he was a little alarmed at what he'd done, and he asked my learned predecessor, Sir Thomas Erskine May, to find him a precedent. And May did, and it came from the early days of the Long Parliament, so it was quite long in the tooth by then. And May later said, "I've discovered what convinces the House of Commons better than any argument. I have discovered a precedent." But of course May's predecessor but two, John Lee, who was Clerk of the House of Commons 1820 to 1850, said, "To hell with precedent, the House can do what it likes." So I think you pays your money and you takes your choice.
Thank you.
Kelvin Hopkins.
Thank you, Chair. Dr. Seward, in the past, how have periods of minority government and political instability affected the role and prominence of the Speaker? Lord Liz-Vane's
Well, alluded to one set of occasions in the 70s, and I think that's probably the sort of most accessible example. I mean, there have obviously been four periods of minority government since 1900, the Liberal minority government in 1910, which is slightly different because of the role of the Labour and the Irish nationalists in supporting Liberal government. There's the 1924 minority government and the 29 to 31 minority government. George Thomas's autobiography on his period during the 76-79 minority is very interesting read on this subject. I mean, there are sort of key decisions that he makes, such as the hybridity question on the aircraft and shipbuilding industries bill, which affect very, very materially the whole programme of the Labour government, and they're very finely balanced. And selection of amendments and so on. I think it just proves Lord Liz-Vane's point that I think in those periods those decisions are really, really important and make a difference in a way that perhaps they don't in other circumstances. I think it's not quite a minority government, but I was also reading Betty Boothroyd's autobiography about the whatever it was, Amendment 27 in the Maastricht Bill, which was the key amendment, which would unite opponents of the bill and from the Conservative side and the Labour side, and it's a finely balanced decision which could go both ways, but in normal circumstances perhaps it wouldn't matter so much. In these circumstances, it does have huge salience.
Thank you. Lord Liz-Vane, you've anticipated my next question, but I'll read it anyway. How, in your view, does minority government affect the role and responsibilities of the Speaker? You may want to come on to that again. But to my second question, what effect has the Fixed Term Parliaments Act 2011 had on the role of the Speaker?
I don't think it's yet had any effect on the role of the Speaker. It has had a broader effect, of course, because there are only two humane killers, if I can put it that way, to end a parliament. One is the two-thirds majority, that there shall be an early general election. One is the straightforward loss of confidence, not assuaged by a confidence motion approved within 14 days. I think that there is a possibility that the role of the chair, if we get into the second of those circumstances, will be extremely important. If you have the possibility that an existing administration loses the no confidence vote, you've then got 14 days to put something together. Now, the Fixed Term Parliaments Act, and I don't think this is an ideal piece of drafting, talks about, I don't think it was an ideal piece of drafting in many ways, but perhaps we shouldn't go down that rabbit hole this morning. But when it talks about the second motion, it talks about that this House has confidence in Her Majesty's government. Now, if that's to be a valid motion, there must be a government. You've then got the difficulty, and Vernon Bogdanor, I'm sure that you and your experts, Chair, will have looked back at this in Canada in the 1920s, where a leader of the opposition went to the Governor-General with an assertion that he had the numbers. Now, if the same thing happens here, and the leader of a grouping, I will be no more specific than that, were to go to Her Majesty and say, I have the numbers, quite reasonably, Her Majesty would say, well, I'm going to want to work on something more substantial than that. And indeed, were she to call for the leader of that alternative grouping, and forgive me for this slightly lengthy prelude, but were she to call for the leader of that grouping and the House of Commons disagree with her, then I think that would be most unfortunate, because the House of Commons would be passing a judgment on the sovereign's judgment. So what is bound to happen, I think, in those circumstances is possibly a series of motions which seek to demonstrate that a particular grouping or a particular leadership of a grouping can command the confidence of the House of Commons. And if that happens, we get straight into the issue of question already decided in the same session, and also into the selection of amendments, because these will be highly explosive, they'll be enormously important, because they will be about whether there is support for an alternative administration. And clearly, the occupant of the chair, in this case it would be the Speaker, we're talking about motions on the floor, that will be extremely important.
That leads straight on to my last question in this group. Do you think that parliamentary procedure provides enough clarity for speakers in these circumstances?
I don't think that you can have a fully comprehensive and, as it were, irreplaceable rule book. It's always going to be a matter of interpretation. And certainly I used to describe the role that clerks had. It wasn't a slavish description of what is in the rules, so that's the rule. It was the woodcraft, as it were, associated with that in a parliamentary culture, in a particular situation. What is the appropriate application of the rule? Now, I've seen quite a few suggestions that the standing orders need to be rewritten in some form which puts them beyond misinterpretation or multiple interpretations. I think that's a bit of a will-o'-the-wisp. When I was Clerk of the House, we did a housekeeping exercise on the standing orders, and that was an overdue and very useful thing. It wasn't a complete recasting. But if there is doubt, and there might be on one rubbing point, is the use of the word forthwith. Does that mean immediately, in other words, with no intervening proceeding, or what does it mean? Now, if it is the will of the House that forthwith is not to be interpreted as anything but immediate, then perhaps you could add without any intervening proceeding or amendment proposed, or something of that sort. But I did, yesterday, have a quick look through the standing orders. There are an awful lot of forthwiths.
In that particular case, on the forthwith question, it was in a business motion, and the House had already voted, presumably in the expectation that forthwith meant what it usually meant, which is without amendment. What kind of conversation might have taken place between the clerk and the Speaker about that matter before he gave his ruling?
Well, I'm not going to mark any prep today, Chair, and I don't think that I'll speculate on what might have been said on either side. But I think also that there's a word of warning. You can be you can attempt too comprehensive an approach I mean, there was, if you'll forgive me, my father used to give very good advice on over-specification in statute. And the example he gave was of a rule alleged to have been enforced at the University of Heidelberg, which after an unpleasant occasion, instead of a breach of common sense as a breach of a rule, was amended to say nobody may tie anything, whether a night watchman or not a night watchman, to anything, whether a lightning conductor or not a lightning conductor, at any time, whether or not during a thunderstorm. So over-specification has its own traps, and I think the standing orders are probably quite long enough already.
But in the case of forthwith, one member, honourable member, was advised by the Table Office that they wouldn't accept any amendments because they would be out of order.
I hear what you say, yes.
Through a different channel, an amendment was tabled and accepted by the Speaker. So it wasn't exactly a level playing field at that particular point.
Well, I was aware of that.
Malcolm Jack, your predecessor, told us in January that as a result of amendments, or was it in January? No, it was a bit after that, but told us as a result of amendments both to the EU Withdrawal Bill and to the taking of business under it, the Commons is now directing national policy in a way hitherto unimaginable. Do you agree with that statement?
I wouldn't say that it's hitherto unimaginable because, and Dr. Seawood will correct me on this, there have been lots of examples of the House in its earlier form directing national policy, not least during the Civil War. There's one occasion of the House actually concluding a treaty by itself, which didn't last more than 7 months, but that may not be a good precedent. Yes, I agree with the statement without reaching a judgment on the value of the activity.
And how adapted is the role of the Speaker and the standing orders to these circumstances?
I wouldn't say under the standing orders, because if the standing orders, as it were, cut the chair free to exercise judgment which is not precisely according to what the standing orders say, then you're in a completely new situation. When I was Clerk of the House, the Speaker wished to call a third amendment to the debate on the Queen's speech, to provide for a referendum on membership of the European Union, strangely. And I said that the standing order allows you to call 2 amendments on the final day, not 3. I leave that tension with you.
Moving on to question 7, I think, actually. Go on in.
Greater transparency in how the Speaker's decisions are reached.
I think that there are really good reasons for not giving reasons for things like allowing or not allowing an urgent question. Certainly for the selection of amendments, I think it would be a most retrograde step. I know it's done in some parliaments. I think that what would happen here would be an endless wrangle about whether the reasons were sufficient. I think the House, over the years, has given the Speaker huge powers, much greater than the presiding officer in many parliaments, and that has normally been the compact has been on a pretty clear expectation on how they're going to be used. And I think that the idea of giving reasons for everything, I think that would be, as I say, a very retrograde step, and I don't think that it would be particularly to the House's advantage.
Should the advice of the clerks be published?
Absolutely not. And I think there are 2 reasons for that. One is that it would inhibit the giving of what is often blisteringly frank advice. And I think also that it would be the classic thing of the classic phenomenon of publishing advice. Yes, there is some advice that's published, but that's not actually the advice that has been given, which would have been given orally.
So are there occasions when the Speaker and his 3 deputies should be working more as a team to reach decisions on significant issues?
I agree absolutely. The deputies, and of course in our current arrangements. They are elected by the House. The Speaker and the deputies should be a very close-knit team. I think any new Speaker needs to think about giving improving the cohesion of the team, which is, I think, would be helped by giving them more exposure and authority. And to have 3 experienced parliamentarians given that task by the House, I think, is a huge plus for any Speaker. It's a great advantage.
Should there be a formal agreement?
No, I think that goes back to your original question about transparency. If there is formal agreement, how do you make that effective? How do you manage it? I think if you've got 4 people who know each other well and trust each other and are united in wanting to do a particular type of job, then I think it should happen without the bureaucracy of formal agreements.
But if you don't have 4 people who know each other well and trust each other,
I would say they should jolly well get on with it.
Should there be something in standing orders to require that conversation to take place?
No, because I don't think in Commons terms it would be justiciable.
Well, it doesn't matter if it's justiciable. It just means that the conversation couldn't be artificially curtailed if it was laid down in standing orders. It had to happen.
I mean, I think it might make people feel better to have an ideal set out in standing orders, but it's going to make no difference if the individuals concerned aren't going to be able to work in that way. I wouldn't rule out some sort of desideratum saying that the team should work in such and such a cooperative way, but I think it would be a waste of paper, as I say. I think get on and do it.
Then how do I mean, there's no doubt that if the Speaker chooses to say, this is my decision and I've made a decision, we'll move on, there's no way you can stop him doing that then?
I think you've got to distinguish between the cooperation that there is and should be within the chair team and those decisions which are for the Speaker as an individual and for which the Speaker takes personal responsibility.
But that's the problem, isn't it? That there is I would say, an increasing concern that the Speaker is acting in these very controversial questions alone, not in that consensual manner that you have described would be preferable.
I think you're taking me out of my comfort zone in terms of my past career and experience.
No, I'm not asking. I'm not trying to expose any prior conversations you've had. I'm just saying that at the moment the Speaker has the power to act capriciously. What are the checks and balances on the Speaker not to act capriciously? I mean, I've described the potential of the Speakership to become just a majoritarian dictatorship. So long as he stays in office, he can take whatever decisions he likes.
Well, I think I would put that against a broader background. I would say we're coming to the end of one Speakership, and any new Speakership is going to take a lot of experience and deductions from the last few years.
At the daily Speakers' Conference, is there a minute taken of the discussion?
No.
For the historical
in my experience, no.
Shouldn't there be a historical record of that discussion? Wouldn't that act as at least some check that one day it will be exposed what the nature of the decision was and how it was reached?
I suppose you could do that. I would be doubtful about its value. You're not dealing with, as it were, an extensive deliberative occasion. You're dealing with a very fast-moving, decisive occasion.
Okay, moving on.
Chair, if I may just intervene on that. I mean, one thing about taking a minute, and it's saying the civil service and government discussions behind closed doors, it changes the nature of those discussions if they know it's going to be recorded.
It does indeed. I mean, in terms of freedom of information, I think that will be covered by Section 34. Clearly, it will be related to proceedings in Parliament and have the protection of that section. But when you start writing things down in that way, I may sound extremely old-fashioned and overcautious, then there is automatically pressure to say, well, let's see this. Why was a UQ on X or Y refused?
Mr. Morris.
Thank you, Chair. Gentlemen, the impartiality of the Speaker is considered a key convention. How has this convention been maintained in the UK, whilst it has been politicised in other countries?
I'm very readily looking at Dr. Seward.
I think that's a very interesting question, and I think the obvious answer is because of the crucial particularity of the UK system, which is that ministers sit in Parliament. In America, of course, the Speaker is essentially the leader of a party in the House of Representatives, but here the key leadership role is taken by the Prime Minister. It's not a coincidence, I think, that the person who most creates our idea of the speakership, Arthur Onslow, in the mid 18th century, is in office at the same time as the person who most creates our idea of the Prime Minister, Robert Walpole. And Walpole's dominance, I think, and Onslow's dominance creates sort of our idea of those two separate roles. But I think there's a second and sort of underlying reason, which is that the role of the Speaker gets established before a modern idea of party becomes so strongly embedded in the political system. I think it's very suggestive. If you look at that, there's a very interesting moment between about 1694 and 1715 where there are two very powerful. There's a very powerful sense of party, Tory and Whig, and their competition within the political structures for all sorts of complicated reasons to do with the Revolution of 1689 and the Triennial Act, meaning you have three elections happening every 3 years. And at that moment, you do get speakers who are much more like Nancy Pelosi is now. They are Robert Harley or Paul Foley, or several Tory speakers as well. William Bromley, for example. These are people who Harley even holds the position of Secretary of State at the same time as holding the position of Speaker, which is, in modern terms, and even then, was sort of rather outrageous. But that really stops after 1715. The speakership, or a little while after 1715, it doesn't really go on. There's the convention that a speaker holds or is able to hold the speakership for multiple parliaments and across a change of party, which is something that we conventionally assume is established with Shaw Lefebvre in 1841. So it's there are. It isn't as if it all comes in at one time, but I think that's the moment at which it's conventionally thought to happen. And it's very interesting that since sort of 1715, really. Very few of our speakers have been major political figures, and they haven't, because of all of this collection of circumstances about the way in which our speakership have worked. Speakers have generally been relatively less prominent politicians. There are a few exceptions, and Selwyn Lloyd is the most obvious in recent terms. But by and large, that's held for quite a long time.
Do you add anything to that?
Not to that erudition, no. Thank you, Chair.
David Jones.
Yes, Lord Lisvane, certain honourable members have been known relatively recently to express concern about the impartiality or otherwise of speakers. What challenges do speakers face in maintaining both impartiality and, perhaps just as importantly, the perception of impartiality?
I think with a new speakership about to start, it's worth drawing a distinction between neutrality and impartiality. It may well be that, and the sound of dancing on the head of a pin perhaps is becoming deafening, but let me explain what I mean. I think it is, you can't expect an incoming speaker to be entirely neutral on every question of the day. The real question is how contentious or divisive that issue is. If somebody comes to the chair, for example, with a lifelong campaigning to for the proper treatment of children and young people suffering from Down syndrome. That is not something which is simply going to fall away when that person occupies the chair. Impartiality, on the other hand, I think the proof of the pudding is in the decisions made. And when you talk about the perception, then I think over time one builds up, the House will build up a picture of that impartiality. And if it is absolutely clear that it doesn't matter which side of the House you come from, and in our current political circumstances, perhaps even which faction on which side of the House you come from, then that is something that you can define impartiality as not being swayed by the origin of a suggestion or the individual who is making it. In terms of the perception, I think that has to be built up over time as the House grows in confidence with a new Speaker.
Thank you. Moving on, Eleanor Smith.
Thank you. Lord Lisbon, what do you think should be the strategic priorities of the next Speaker for the House services?
Can I deal with two organisational points first, which aren't really strategic, but I think they are about empowering the new Speaker. First of all, I think any new Speaker has got to be aware of becoming a prisoner of the diary. Whenever one person takes over a high-profile job from another, the diary legacy is huge, and the new Speaker, I think, will need to be absolutely ruthless going through the diary, perhaps for 3 or 4 years ahead, and deciding what he or she really wants to do. Second, I think it's time to modernise the Speaker's office. I think it's decades out of date. We should do what other parliaments do, or principally I've got in mind the Bundestag and the Assemblée Nationale, where it is the brightest and best in the House service who go through the Speaker's office, and it is something, as it were, it's a campaign ribbon that if you're going to aspire to the highest jobs in the House service, that you should have. And I think that will be good for the support of the Speaker, and I think it will be very encouraging for the House service. I think the opportunity to do a bit of reorganisation at the same time should be taken. You would need a principal private secretary, who I would say should serve for no more than 5 years, and perhaps some deputy private secretaries specialising in particular areas, House business, international relations, for example. And I think that those changes should be made pretty rapidly. Now, in terms of the strategic priorities, forgive me.
Get on that a little bit. Isn't it up to the Speaker who he or she appoints to his or her office?
That's the situation at the moment, yes.
And should that change?
I believe so, yes.
So, to protect the impartiality of the Speaker, you are actually going to buttress the Speaker with if you like, a permanent and impartial civil service?
In miniature.
Right, okay. That's quite a big change, isn't it? It's quite a big... I mean, the push in government is in the opposite direction.
Yes, it is. And I think there are judgments to be made about that.
Right.
In terms of strategic priorities, a huge one is going to be re-establishing and rebuilding trust in Parliament. And we've had 3 years where the House of Commons and Parliament as a whole has taken knock after knock after knock. And I think a new Speaker has got to have that front and centre of whatever she or he wants to do. I think as well, we've talked about the deputies. I think giving more exposure and authority to the chair team would be a good change. Again, that's hardly a strategic priority, but it is a way of doing business. I think it's very important, incidentally, if I can speak as a member of the ex-clerk of the House Union, I think it's extremely important for the Speaker to give real support to the Clerk of the House. That job is a hideously full-on one. Chief Executive of the House Service, even though there's a Director General, but he reports to the Clerk. principal advisor on the constitutional and business matters to the House, accounting officer, corporate officer, data controller. It is a very, very heavy job, and you can't do it easily without very strong support from the chair, I suggest. I think the bullying culture needs to be wholly driven out, and my impression is that this hasn't happened yet, although progress has been made. I think there are so many things which a speaker, as it were, incoming, will be offered. He or she could occupy every day from now for the next 5 years picking up invitations. But I think the overall theme, that perhaps the test, needs to be about rebuilding trust, and the subsets of that are going to be outreach, education. I was very keen, for example, that there should be a scheme of speakers' scholars, which hasn't quite been achieved. But I think that that would be it would be a complement to the Clerk of the House's Clerk's Apprentices scheme, for example. I think there are serious questions to address for a new speaker about international relations. How important are those going to be, particularly in terms of the inevitable strains on the Union? The current arrangement known as the Quad, the meeting of the 4 presiding officers, I think that's something that a new speaker should be able to use extremely constructively, and it's one where the real interest and support of the speaker, I know, would be hugely, of course, it's a situation in Northern Ireland which we hope is going to be temporary, but would be hugely appreciated by the presiding officers of the other assemblies and parliaments.
We've looked very closely at the relationship between secretaries of state and their senior officials, and this trust and confidence thing is obviously vital to the functioning of a government department, and I can see that that applies to the Speaker. But one of the recommendations we made was, it should be possible to say, look, the Permanent Secretary should be able to go to the Cabinet Secretary and say, now look, we're just not getting on, you need to find somebody else to do this job. That's always going to be the case, isn't it? I realise I'm very near the bone on this point, but practically speaking, if for that relationship of trust and confidence to exist, sometimes it just won't.
Yeah, that's life.
That's life. There was another point I was going to occupy the committee's time with, but I will move on. Yes, indeed, far away.
You've already anticipated my question, actually, earlier on, and it was about is it appropriate for the Speaker of the Chair of the House to be the Commons Commissioner? What approach should the Speaker take in chairing the Commission? And how desirable might it be to have a separately elected Chair of the Commission?
Well, as I said earlier, I think the chairmanship of the Commission should be separate and distinct. And given what I've just been saying about the strategic priorities of a new Speaker, I mean, that's a very, very big portfolio. And I think to burden the Speaker further, and as we move towards changes on restoration and renewal, for example, the job of the chair of the Commission is going to, never mind the body set up by statute to supervise, but there are going to be a lot of questions which come to the Commission and to its chair. So that is going to become a heavier task. An incoming Speaker is going to have a very heavy task, and I think to combine the two jobs simply overfreights both. And I would argue for the clarity and separation of separate chairing of the Commission.
Are you disappointed that the Cox report has taken so long to implement?
I don't. I think I'm going to avoid answering your question, Chair, because I simply don't know enough about it. As I said, when I said that the bullying culture needed to be extirpated, and I didn't think that this had been yet achieved, That's purely an impressionistic judgment, and I've had nothing to do with the process, so I think I'd better leave it there.
On the question of how some of these reforms that you recommend should be made, such as splitting the chairmanship of the Commission from the Speakership, the Straw Committee seemed to be a reasonable method of proceeding, a special select committee appointed for the purpose. What do you think of establishing a similar committee to review the role of the Speaker?
I would counsel very strongly against it now, because inevitably, and if I may say so, some of the questions that have been in the forefront of your minds this morning have tended to reinforce my view. It would be an inquiry into personalities and events and particularities. And I think also it would be very unfair on an incoming Speaker. I think whoever takes the chair, and it is it is, as some speakers have said, on assuming the office in the past, is the highest honour that the House has in its power to bestow. And I think a new Speaker, I would argue very strongly for giving a new Speaker some time to get used to the role, for the House to see how that role is being exercised and what particularly that individual is bringing to the role. Now, it may be that in a couple of years' time that the time is ripe for that sort of inquiry. But at the moment, I think it would be potentially very destabilising and, as I say, very difficult indeed for the incoming Speaker.
And what of the proposal, the alternative proposal, the Speaker, him or herself, the next one, as has been suggested by one or two of the candidates, that there should be a Speakers' Conference to look at such matters?
Well, I think the same arguments apply to that. And a Speakers' Conference, of course, is, as you well know, is a highly technical term, which in the past has had particular requirements as to the way it's organised and who takes part in it. So I would see a Speakers' Conference simply as a select committee in a different guise.
But how proper would it be for the Speaker, him or herself, to chair the proceedings looking into the role of their own office?
Oh, I don't think it would be proper at all.
Right. So you wouldn't favour a Speakers' Conference?
If that is what a Speakers' Conference would involve, and the Speakers' Conferences, I mean, the whole concept has been a bit protean in the course of the 20th century, but I think we're looking at a sort of a select committee inquiry, and as I say, I think that anything, until things have been able to settle down and the new Speaker establish a way in which she or he wants to do the job, I think it would be extremely... I think it would be destabilising and way ahead of its time. And
how much do you think that in 2 years' time it needs to be a special select committee rather than just this committee or another committee, the Procedure Committee?
That will be for others to judge. I think a committee which can do a good job, I'm not going to sit here and suggest that this committee could not do it, I think the means are less important than the way it's done.
Well, except that if the House doesn't appoint a committee especially for the purpose, the committee's findings don't have the same authority, do they?
No, I think that's fair enough. If the House is giving a specific task in the very old-fashioned way that select committees used to operate, then the House, as it were, is there ready to receive and expecting the results of what it's set up.
Can I just divert the conversation very briefly at the end of this to just take this opportunity while you're giving us evidence on this matter, to ask about your reaction to the Supreme Court's intervention in the Prorogation affair. Do you have any particular thoughts about that?
Yes, I do. I wasn't as alarmed about it as I think in advance I expected to be. It seemed to me that the distinction which the Supreme Court drew between establishing the limits of prerogative and deciding whether prerogative was lawfully exercised or the advice to exercise the prerogative was lawfully given within those parameters was correct. I found some of the arguments put forward by the government, if I can say politely, they were unconvincing. The idea that in the last set of circumstances Parliament could itself have legislated to stop itself being prorogued, I think that was a non-starter. I felt that the court was having satisfied itself as to justiciability, on which of course it differed from the divisional court. I think in paragraph 52 of the judgment, which is the sort of nutshell about justiciability, and I found that convincing. I found paragraphs 63 to 69 on Article 9. I found those convincing, but it was a close call. The argument in a sentence was that this was not a proceeding in Parliament because it was something which Parliament was having done to itself. And so it fell outside Article 9, and so the courts were able to have a locus. I thought I was tempted to ask, I'm not sure whether I will do this next time I see her, to ask Lady Hale whether they would have come to the same decision if the point at issue had been royal assent, which seems to me to contain a lot of the considerations about whether it is a proceeding or not a proceeding that prorogation raises. Overall, though, I mean, I think there's some fairly hyperbolic views going around that now that the Supreme Court has decided on a question like this particular one, although the judgment said at the beginning that these were extraordinary circumstances which would probably never occur, the hyperbolic arguments are that now the courts can trample all over prerogative. Well, of course, the extent of prerogative, and you have only to look at Fire Brigades Union and De Casa, the two cases which the court quoted, this is nothing new. I think there may be a temptation to bring cases which you hope will end up in the Supreme Court and will be decided upon the same principles, but I can't see an immediate threat. I may regret my words before long, but I can't see an immediate difficulty.
Of course, it quoted Chater and the rather narrow definition, or rather the narrow definition of the purpose of Article 9, which is only to protect free speech. If that's where Article 9 finishes up, does that alter your view that we might need to legislate for prerogative rather than to leave it as a matter of understandings between the courts and Parliament?
Not at the moment. The Supreme Court quoted Chater, and of course those of us, so to speak, in the business never had the slightest doubt that that would be judicially defined as falling outside the operation of Article 9. But the court also, they didn't limit themselves to protecting free speech. And of course proceedings are so very much wider, indeed being protected this morning, for example, are so very much wider than debate in the chamber. But the Supreme Court did also mention the issue of exclusive cognizance. So I think they approached it on a fairly broad front.
Do you think the court would still recognise the exclusive cognizance included the Duncan Sands judgment, which MPs should regard as very important, protecting what we are preparing for debates in Parliament?
The Duncan Sands case it was decided, I think, at a time when there was a tendency to define these things more rigorously and more closely. I think that matters, and I've always held the view, and I've so advised, that matters which are evidently preparatory to a proceeding and sufficiently closely linked to be specifically for that purpose are going to be protected by Article 9. Now, I wouldn't want in all circumstances that advice to be tested in the Supreme Court, but I would think, given the way that the court, it's just my feeling, given that the way that the court approached this, I think it would be a safeguard.
Okay. Great. Yes.
Just following this point, there are those who think that the establishment of the Supreme Court was a significant, small but significant step towards the Americanisation of the British Constitution. Following this judgment, which was seen by some to be political, might it not be now the case where future governments or the political realm in general might take an interest in the membership of the Supreme Court as they do in the United States? And this would change the nature of our constitution, the independence of the judiciary, and so on. Do you have any thoughts on those points?
Well, I think that would be disastrous for our system. I noted that the Prime Minister said that he agreed with the judgment of the Supreme Court, but that there would be consequences. And I vigorously hope that those consequences don't include thoughts about how the membership of the Supreme Court is decided in future, because that is a non-return valve once you politicise appointments. And of course we have a different system from that in the United States, where the court structure and the structure of the judiciary feeds upwards into the Supreme Court. So there would be questions to be asked perhaps at a lower level of the judiciary, the High Court, before you went down that road, but I would sincerely hope that no government is even going to set its foot on that road.
Thank you.
Well, can I thank you both very much indeed for a very, very interesting session, very topical, and I hope those who are choosing the next speaker will reflect upon your words.
Thank you very much, Chair.
i.e. all of us. Thank you very much. And can we have the next witnesses, please? Could I ask each of you to identify yourselves for the record, please?
Natasha Engel, former Deputy Speaker, 2015 to 2017.
George Young, former Government Chief Whip, former Leader of the House of Commons.
Well, it's very nice to see two old friends in front of this committee. And can I thank you for taking the trouble to listen to the proceedings so far this morning, because it will enable us to go a little bit faster and to have a more informed discussion. Have you, first of all, got anything to add to what extent... No, I've lost it. To what extent... what are the main role and functions of the Speaker, and to what extent they are complementary or conflicting?
I'm assuming we're going to get sort of generally the same sort of question, so I won't try and kind of answer everything that went before. But I think having heard the sort of the very kind of constitutional approach to this, I think sort of looking at it more politically, I think actually there is a sort of for me, a sort of a tension between allowing Parliament to express its will. I think that's the issue for me that's sort of come out of the last evidence session. Allowing Parliament to express its will, but also allowing government to manage the time in the House, which I'm sure George will talk more about. And one of the issues for me is really about it is an important part of the Speaker's role that the Speakership does allow Parliament to express its will. But how is that identified and how is that done? At the moment, and Lord Lisvane mentioned that it's an interpretation, the Speaker interprets the will of the House. But I think you then get into slight sort of difficult areas, as we've seen recently, is that the Speaker has made decisions on what he thinks the will of the House is without that actually really being able to be tested. And I think that it's a sort of a positive versus a negative, so that when we saw House of Lords reform votes, for instance, that the House is very good at expressing what it doesn't want, but it's quite bad at expressing what it does want. And so when the Speaker effectively gives Parliament the powers to table legislation, and we get nowhere at all because that's not the role of Parliament. The role of Parliament is to scrutinise legislation. That's when we get to a stalemate. And I think that that's, for me, from a sort of a political perspective, one of the really big evolutions in the role of the Speakership, and one where I think there are some real problems.
Lord Young.
Well, I think in a nutshell, I like the analogy of the football referee, who neutral, respected, authoritative, whose interest is in seeing a fair game between two opposing sides, who blows the whistle when he has to, but then gets the game going again as fast as he can, but who does not kick the ball towards any one particular direction. And I think the good referees are the ones that never appear in the news, the ones that people don't notice, because the game has been allowed to go on without major intervention, without drawing attention to themselves. And quite often when the referee becomes the story, or the umpire in cricket becomes the story, it's just an indication that something somewhere may have gone wrong.
I mean, yesterday in the House of Commons, I did make a remark that was based on the fact that the government itself seemed unable to be allowed an opportunity for the House to express its opinion on a motion that is absolutely crucial to the government's policy, that it was amended on Saturday and then denied an opportunity yesterday. How usual or unusual is it for the Speaker to prevent the government's business being considered?
Well, I think you have to look at what happened yesterday against a background of other decisions, which I know, Sir Bernard, have irritated you. And I think the key role of a Speaker is that when you stand back and look at the decisions as a whole, you can see, yes, neutral and impartial. And I think the difficulty arises when some of the decisions go against standing orders and are seen by one side of the House to be more against their interests than in favour. And I think that's one of the risks that a Speaker runs, if, firstly, moving against standing orders, and secondly, a consistency, perhaps against a background of views which the Speaker is known to hold and has not kept secret. I think those are the risks that a Speaker runs, and I hope that a new Speaker may seek to avoid them.
I mean, I'd go a little bit further than that. I think certainly sort of more from the outside now. I think it is regarded that the Speaker has made decisions that one side is pleased with and the other side is displeased with, which is the point that you raised yesterday. And at that point, that sort of neutrality and impartiality, no matter which side you're on, does become an issue. And I think the other thing that your point of order and all the other points of order yesterday that highlighted was that that's what happens when a Speaker starts to justify the decision that he's made. And I thought that it was just a perfect demonstration of why it is that a Speaker doesn't say why he's come to a certain decision, because otherwise then you spend, a couple of hours taking points of order trying to justify that decision. So, I mean, I think that there were two sort of slight novelties yesterday.
In one intervention from Ms. Maria Eagle that pointed out, what a welcome counterbalance to the overmighty executive the Speaker has become. But I would say that was in answer to his response to me. That is the one consistent theme of all his rulings, which is that they cause trouble for the government. Is that an objective way, or could that be justified as an objective way of making sure the House expresses its will?
I mean, I think this is probably the point that I feel most strongly about, is that, and my parliamentary history doesn't go back so far as I go back to just about Betty Boothroyd and no further. So, it kind of, in that light, actually, when I was first elected, we had very large majorities, and actually the power of the executive was overwhelming. And I remember we had conversations in the early days about how does one, as a ordinary backbencher, actually just express something that they feel. I mean, it was often difficult, even, you sometimes had adjournment debates, and the government was in control of everything all the time. But over time, and even in that short period since 2005, there have been certainly lower majorities up to now where there is no majority at all. But there have been innovations such as the Backbench Business Committee, where it is possible for the House to express its will, and even actually, change standing orders, where it is very, very different from when there were very large majorities. And I would say that actually the speakership now has tilted the balance the other way, so that where governments were all-powerful, you now have a situation where Parliament is all-powerful, and the Speaker, by, whether you call it a creative interpretation of the rules or abusing the rules, has enabled Parliament to put forward legislation in a way that it wasn't able to do before. It has effectively given Parliament the powers of the executive. So I would say that the balance has shifted in completely the wrong way and hasn't done Parliament any favours.
Mr Jones, I'm sorry, I've trespassed slightly.
You have indeed, Chairman. The question I was going to ask was what is the role of the Speaker in the relationship between the House and the Government, and how have you observed it evolve over time?
Well, that definitely, and I think I think the point that was made was that when the Speaker was first elected, he came in as the champion of Parliament, and I think at that time Parliament, so MPs, backbenchers, as opposed to the executive, were very much regarded as representatives of people, so that these were elected local constituency MPs as opposed to the executive. And I think in those days you could say that Parliament did really represent the people, and therefore by proxy the Speaker being the champion of Parliament meant that he was by proxy champion of the people. I think that's different now, and certainly having sort of been outside for 2 years, I see that very differently now, where people are very, very angry about what's happening in Parliament, and actually the championing of Parliament is actually sort of, certainly from outside, the more that happens, the angrier people get. And that kind of power balance...
You see a fault line between the people and the people representing the people in Parliament.
Yeah, definitely.
And do you attribute that to the actions of the Speaker?
No, I don't. No, absolutely not. I'm saying that when the Speaker was first elected, he was very clear that he was the champion of Parliament, which he continues to be. And I don't think anybody sort of, when it comes to championing government versus Parliament, the Speaker is very much on the side of Parliament. But I think in the days when Parliament was largely representative of people outside. And the referendum changed things so that the number of people who voted in the referendum versus the number of people in Parliament who feel a different way, that has changed the balance, and so that the championing of the rights of Parliament by the Speaker is no longer the same as championing the rights of the people versus the executive. I'm just saying it's a very subtle difference, but that therefore the Speaker's championing of Parliament is much more about those individual MPs rather than the people that they represent. And I think we just have to be a bit aware of that.
Lord Young.
Well, going back to your question about the relationships between the government and the Speaker, on a personal basis, both as Government Chief Whip and as Leader of the House, I always sought to have a good personal relationship with the Speaker, as someone representing the government. It's no secret that there are some points of tension. The issue about the extra amendment being called on the Queen's speech was obviously an issue where the government took a slightly different view to the Speaker. Likewise, forthwith, which was after I left your house, that was obviously an issue of tension between government and Speaker, where we thought the rules were clear and there was a different interpretation. On things like UQs, it is the role of the Speaker to help make life difficult for the government by allowing lots of UQs. So as far as I was concerned, that was sort of fair game. There is an issue when you're trying to manage the business of the House and you've allocated what you think is a reasonable time for the report stage of a bill or the second reading, and you find not so much that there is a UQ or two UQs or perhaps a government statement, but the length of time that it takes means that what you had thought was an adequate time for the government, for the House to consider the remaining stages of a bill, gets squeezed, and then the government gets blamed for not allowing adequate time to scrutinise legislation. So there's a bit of an issue there. Then there'll be other issues which the Speaker would raise with the government, which he probably raised with the opposition as well, like the noise at Prime Minister's questions. What could I, as the Chief Whip or Leader of the House, do to give a slightly better impression of the House by persuading my colleagues to lower the decibel count, something at which I think everybody has singularly failed to do. But in the management of the business, the Speaker does not actually play a role. That's done through the usual channels, the Chief Whip, the Leader of the House, and the representatives of the other parties. So the Speaker isn't, as it were, in the frame when it comes to what we're going to debate next week. But he does have an impact, as I said a moment ago, on the management of business. And just as a footnote, having moved from your house to my house, there is a time limit on statements, 40 minutes. That means you get shorter questions, shorter answers, and questions tend not to be repetitive. And also when it comes to managing the business of the House, you know how long it's going to take. So I think that was becoming an issue of managing the business between the government and the Speaker, that he was preempting to himself more time, overrunning Prime Minister's questions, which is clearly set out in standing orders, half an hour, gradually squeezing not just the government, but at times the opposition from time which they thought they had.
Can I add to that, actually? Because I think it's not just government that sort of suffered with the urgent questions. It was that certainly as a backbencher, I found also that it was quite difficult to manage our time, because obviously, you know, you sort of squish lots of things in the day and then suddenly there's an urgent question that is of a constituency interest that, you know, and that happened more and more and more, and that actually in terms of management of the time, when we were on the right committee together, the who controls time issue was the big one. And at that time, government controlled pretty much all of the time. But, you know, together with the Backbench Business Committee having 1 day a week effectively allocated to it, and therefore to backbenchers, and then with the encroachment of several UQs sometimes in 1 day, plus then also the tabling of emergency debates, it means that that really squeezes down the sort of the managed time by government. And again, you know, you're sort of starting to have a look at where the balance actually lies between Parliament and government. I mean, that may be a good thing. I'm just saying that this is something that, in terms of the evolution over the last couple of years, that's definitely been a feature.
Thank you.
Hopkins.
Thank you, Chair. I think, Lord Lang, you anticipated to an extent my first question. I'll ask it anyway, just in case you want to add something. When you were Leader of the House, to what extent was it the role of the Speaker to facilitate the progress of government business?
To what extent was it the...
was it the role of the Speaker to facilitate the progress of government business when you were Leader of the House?
No, I don't think that was his job at all, to facilitate the government. His job was to make sure that the House of Commons had adequate time to consider the legislation. And quite often, he would not facilitate the business of government, but for very good reasons. For example, by choosing unhelpful amendments, for example, which the government would not particularly welcome. That was not facilitating the business of government, but it was doing the right thing for the House. So I think there is inevitably some tension between the Leader of the House, whose job it is to get the government's legislation through the Commons, and the Speaker, whose job it is to make sure that the House of Commons fulfills its task of holding the government to account, and not bowing to every request that the government may make. For example, on time, we may say, you know, if you allow this particular, all these UQs today instead of tomorrow, we don't have time for this. But the Speaker may decide to go ahead. So I think it was my job to facilitate the business of government, and the job of the Speaker to make sure he facilitated the job of the House of Commons.
And a question to both of you, really. Where should the balance be between enabling a variety of opinions to be expressed, testing the will of the House, and ensuring the progress of government business? Where should the balance be? Which of those?
I mean, I think actually this is one of the other issues that was raised from the last set of witnesses, was that there is a difference between the way that an individual conducts themselves in the role of chair. So, you know, all the different select committees have different chairmen and women, and they do their roles in a very different way, and they differ from their predecessors and will differ from their successors. And that actually a lot of the election of a chair is all about kind of, you elect the person who you think is going to fulfill that role best, and actually those powers and how those powers are used, and whether you want to curb those powers, and where that balance then lies. And I would kind of, I slightly worry that there has been an evolution. Things have changed quite dramatically, and I think the referendum in 2016 has changed the way that politics is working, and the fact that there are no majorities at the moment. Those are facts that automatically change the balance of things anyway. But I wouldn't say that, especially the point at which we're talking, which is just before the election of a new Speaker, that we make any judgments about what's happened and how that balance has changed, and tie the hands of a future speaker, because I think it's about, especially at the moment, kind of identifying those things that we think the speaker should, that what the speakership should be and what it shouldn't be, and which individual is best placed to do that.
Can I make a slightly different point, which I think is relevant to Mr. Hopkins' question? I think over the last few months, this has not been typical parliamentary business. There has been virtually no serious government legislation. And that has meant that there has been much more opportunity, as I think happened yesterday, to have statement after statement after statement going on and on and on, and UQs going on and on and on. The moment we revert to a more conventional parliament with a Queen's speech with some really heavy legislation, I think the issue that Mr. Hopkins raises will become actually much more acute, in that if the sort of time we've seen preempted over recent days became the habit, it would become very, very difficult indeed for a normal, conventional Queen's speech to be delivered, because there simply wouldn't be the time on the floor of the House. If what has been allowed to happen, with nobody really minding because there's not a lot going on, became the established pattern, and then I think the tensions that Mr. Hopkins raises might become more acute.
Thank you. Ellen Smith?
Okay. Is it the role of the Speaker to enforce the will of the House?
Yes. So long as there isn't real tension between standing orders. And if that's the case, then the House should change standing orders to remove the tension. But perhaps I can just, in answer to that question, raise another issue which has not been raised before. I think the role of the Speaker is changing because we now have hustings, which we never had before. When I first came, there were no elections for the Speaker. It was a formality after a deal between the usual channels, who ensured that the candidate was acceptable to both sides of the House. We then moved to elections. Betty Boothroyd, I don't think there were any hustings at all, and she had support from both sides of the House. Subsequently, we've had hustings, more hustings, so you could say the Speaker now has a mandate, because this is what I said when I was elected, which may sit uneasily with the standing orders. And I think this is something which has evolved over time. Also, the last two speakers, and it's not their fault at all, were elected predominantly with support from one side of the House. With Michael Martin, when there was a public vote, I don't think he got any votes at all from my party. The next one, it was a secret ballot, but we know from our canvass returns that predominantly. And I'm not blaming the Speaker, but I think it did mean they started off with at a disadvantage, in that unlike previous speakers, they hadn't got broad support from both sides of the House. But I think the hustings sit slightly uneasily with enforcing the will of the House, interpreting the will of the House, and interpreting standing orders, if they have put in their manifesto and then got elected, something which is actually at variance with what is in standing orders or what may be the current will of the House. Rather long answer, but I hope it's relevant.
There's something else, though, which is, and again, this is in normal times rather than today, where you've got a sort of a minus majority government. But let's say that there were a majority government and that had stood on a certain manifesto and was trying to put that through Parliament, democratically elected. Is it then the role of the Speaker to enforce the will of the House if that actually goes against what the government wants to do? Traditionally, no. But actually what we're seeing now without a majority and, trapped in government by the Fixed Term Parliament Act, that's exactly what's happening, is that the will of the House is constantly being enforced. But because the government doesn't have a legitimacy, because it doesn't have a majority, it's quite difficult to sort of say whether that's a right or a wrong thing. But, I go back to George's point, these are really, really unusual times. And, if we're sort of legislating, if we're kind of making decisions about what the role of the speakership and the balance of powers should be, at this time, when it's unrepresentative, it might not be the right time to do it.
I'm intrigued you keep touching on the question of legitimacy. And Tony Blair had a vote share of 37% and a majority of 100.
Yeah.
The Conservatives got a vote share of 42% and haven't got an overall majority. And so what you're questioning is the legitimacy of the will of the House in the face of other democratic factors. outside Parliament, such as the
Yes.
referendum, such as the vote shares.
Yeah.
That's what you're all talking about.
I think the thing that really worries me, I mean, I'm working in a place now where we do a lot of polls and focus groups, and which is a bit like door knocking, but it's kind of a bit more kind of organised. And one of the things that I've really been struck by is how highly engaged the public is with politics. I mean, down to the very final constitutional details of what happens in here. And it's very, very angry, and that's something that I've not seen before. And I think actually sometimes decisions at the moment are taken here for perfectly legitimate reasons that don't sound very legitimate outside. And I think there's a sort of a disconnect that's growing, and the more time is taken for that to grow, the more dangerous it becomes. So, I mean, I think we're not talking about this in total isolation, and it's not just a sort of a fine constitutional point. There are people out there who really, really care about this.
Ronnie Cowan.
Yeah, just a brief aside to that, the political consciousness in Scotland has been growing for a number of years. I do get your point there, and it's genuinely catching up. The EU referendum has forced the rest of the United Kingdom to catch up with what we went through prior to the 2014 referendum, and political engagement from the vast majority of people has increased, and as you said, the knowledge of the whole process has increased, and that's something we should welcome. Yeah? Rather than trying to shelter it in this place to make it ours, it's something we have to allow that to filter in through those walls and influence how we work in this place. That wasn't a question. You're in the room alone.
But just to say, yes, welcome political engagement. But if it's negative, then it's quite. If it's sort of red hot anger, then actually that's a sort of engagement that we really need to be aware of. If it's really positive and it's about how do I get more engaged in this process, then that's great. But if people actually are feeling that they have made a choice about something, they have made their voices heard and now they're being ignored, then that's kind of a political engagement that actually could have quite negative consequences. And I just think that that's something that we need to be aware of.
It's something that should start in this place and filter out, because too often in the chamber all you see is red hot anger. And it's only because people disagree with what you're saying. In that situation.
Absolutely. Yeah.
My question. And you've heard it earlier on. I'm curious as to how the Speaker's office actually works with the three deputies and the Speaker. Do you work together as a team, and also should there be more transparency as to how decisions are made?
I mean, we sort of had this discussion earlier about the team of deputy speakers, and I mean the deputy speakers do very much work as a team. We're actually the deputies to the chairman of Ways and Means rather than we're called deputy speakers, but actually we work to the deputy chairman of Ways and Means. So it's the first deputy chairman of Ways and Means and the second deputy chairman of Ways and Means. And we did have a very specific role, which is about scrutinising the finance bill, the budget, and then also committee of the whole House, where it was us who selected the amendment. So, I mean, there was quite a separate role, but the roles are very so. They're physically, there's Speaker's House, and at the other end of Parliament, there's the Deputy Speaker's corridor. So, I mean, they are physically quite removed. And I would say that it could work much better as a team. But again, that entirely depends on the occupant of the chair. I mean, I think if that's what people want and they want to have a more active deputy team that does more specified roles, then that's something that maybe should go into a manifesto of the next Speaker. But it's not something that I would legislate for.
So is it a three-person team or a four-person team?
The Deputy Speaker's team is a three-person team, definitely. But the Speaker's office is a one-person team, definitely. But, I mean, I think they are different roles. As deputies to the Speaker, we are just reserves in order to kind of chair debates that are, when the Speaker does the beginning of the day, does the parliamentary questions, does statements and urgent questions, and the deputies come in afterwards to chair debates after that. And we're very much, certainly when I was a deputy Speaker, we were very much in the reserve at that point. I mean, but it could be something that could be developed. It wasn't something that I felt very strongly about.
Well, I think that the Speaker could show more confidence in his deputies by involving them much more in the discussions. I wouldn't legislate or put it in standing orders, but I think good corporate governance would require the Speaker to consult broadly with 3 other parliamentarians of experience and also show more confidence in them by allowing them to spend more time in the chair than seems to happen at the moment. I think there is a reservoir of experience which is probably, as I understand it, not being tapped at the moment, which might help the Speaker come to his decisions. But only from watching this from outside, I understand that it is much more of a one-man show than a corporate event.
There's another side to this, though, which is that, you know, when you get a PMQ, which is a sort of a real rarity, and then you realise that actually the Prime Minister's abroad and it's going to be the deputies, and that there is a real disappointment. And I think people have the same thing, that if there's a big event, which, you know, big statements, and if you have a deputy in place, I don't know how much people would kind of think, oh, it doesn't kind of give it the grandeur of the occasion. I mean, that's just another side of it. But
the deputy does do the budget.
Yes. I mean, I always thought that the deputies, when the Prime Ministers aren't there for Prime Minister's questions, that one of the deputies should chair PMQs at that point. I thought that would be quite fun.
Okay. The point that occurs to me is about corporate governance. You raised this question of corporate governance of the Speaker's role. But there isn't any, really, is there? It's more like a corporation soul. And we used to set up public bodies in that way. We don't anymore. We set them up with a chairman and a board. To what extent can we create a system of governance around the speakership, which is, as Lord Devise said in the previous session, is vested with very great powers?
Well, I think the structure is already there. You already have a Speaker and 3 deputies, so I don't think you need to change that. I'm cautious about enshrining it in standing orders or legislation for the reasons we heard in the last session. But I think just as people know good corporate governance when they see it, I think they would know good corporate governance by the Speaker when they were satisfied that there was a proper discussion with the Deputy Speakers before a decision had been reached. It is the Speaker's decision, but I think it would give him comfort if it was widely known that at the morning meetings at 12 o'clock or wherever they are, there was a good discussion involving the Deputy Speakers before a decision had been reached. I think that's just a question of how the Speaker decides to run his office, and I hope that's how it might be run in the future.
Kelvin Hopkins.
My little group of questions is specifically to Natasha in her role as Deputy Speaker. As Deputy Speaker, did you feel there was enough clarity in standing orders and Erskine May for you to clearly rule in all situations? And to what extent did you feel bound by previous rulings, or did you feel able to use your usual judgment?
This is this really interesting because actually, and I mean, you're on the chairman's panel.
No.
Well, I mean, just sort of any meetings that you've chaired, there are a set of rules. They're often not as complicated as the standing orders in the House of Commons, but the chairing of a meeting is all about kind of applying those rules in a way that actually, back to your football analogy, keeps the committee going, and that's really what chairing Parliament is like. Is that actually, the standing orders are clear. Erskine May, maybe there's a sort of a bit of room for interpretation. There's lots of advice given. Part of the role of the Speakers' Conference in the morning is to identify issues on the order paper where you can actually foretell that there might be certain procedural issues. And you sort of, you think about how you deal with those. But really it's about being there in the moment and making the decision that is best for that moment, which is never the same as any other. And as you gain experience, you sort of recognise situations as they come up. But actually it is all about your personal judgment, and that's not something that you can really legislate for. And that's why you have a human being in the chair and not a robot.
No, I mean, but the impression you give was that it was relatively straightforward most of the time.
It was relatively straightforward, and the problems arise when there are problems. Ooh. on the floor of the House. That doesn't happen too often, and most of the time it is just it's just keeping the debate going and making sure that you call the right people at the right time.
And as to the advice of the clerks, did you use the advice of the clerks when making decisions in the chamber?
Definitely, but this is back to the point that Lord Lisvane made, is that it is advice, and it is down to the chair to decide whether that is the correct advice to apply at that moment, or whether actually it calls for something else. Which is why I would be very, very strongly against the publication of the clerk's advice, because it's the chair's decision whether or not to take that advice, and it's ultimately it falls to the chair, no one else to take responsibility for those decisions.
Yeah, well, you've actually answered my last question.
Oh, right,
so
sorry,
thank
Kelvin.
You,
sorry.
That's fine. Thank you.
We'll go straight to David Jones.
Yes, Mr. Engel, you've said already that you believe that public trust in politics has been weakened. To what extent would you say it's the personal role of the Speaker to try to restore that trust?
I mean, personally, I was very excited when the current Speaker took over, especially because he made very clear at the outset when he was first elected that he wanted this role to be an ambassador for Parliament, and it came in the wake of the extensive scandal, and I thought actually that sort of public engagement role of the Speaker was exactly what was needed. And one of the first things he did was to allow the UK Youth Parliament to sit in the chamber, and actually I thought that was one of the really strong points, and I hope that subsequent speakers will continue to sort of take on that role of public engagement. I think the problem comes when the public engagement is less about the public engaging with Parliament and more about kind of using it as a platform. And then, that I think is a bit problematic, where then, the speakership has got celebrity status these days in a way that it didn't have before. But I think on the whole, the raising of the profile of Parliament has been a really, really positive thing. I wish that when people had contact with Parliament, they learnt a bit more about it. I think that the establishment of the education unit is absolutely fantastic, getting a vast numbers of young people, unfortunately still quite sort of southeast and London focused, and I think we should probably open up an education unit up in the northwest somewhere. But I think those sort of things have been really, really positive, and I hope that continues.
You mentioned the celebrity status of the Speaker at the moment. Do you think that's a good thing or a bad thing?
It just is. I mean, I think it's up to the next person to decide whether that's what they want to do. I think it detracts.
Would you rather the next person were or were not minded to pursue a celebrity
I would prefer
status?
that they were not.
Right.
Definitely, yeah, definitely. Because I think it detracts from what Parliament does. It sort of, I think it detracts from what Parliament does, and I think that's the important bit that I would really like people to engage with. And also he's become a figure that people who voted Remain love and people who voted Leave hate, and I think that's sort of generally not a good thing. I think that's sort of and that's as far as the outside goes. I mean, whichever side you're on, that's kind of the perception from outside.
And Lord Young, I think this comes to your point about the importance of the referee not being or being anonymous, really.
Yes, being invisible. I just add a footnote to what Natasha has said. And it's true that politicians as a whole are not held in high esteem. But when you ask people about their own MP, they say we're frightfully lucky here. And they will not generalise from their own individual experience. But actually, most MPs are, if I may say so, like the MPs here, conscientious, hard-working, honest people who want to do the right thing for the country. But people won't assume that because their own MP is like that, everyone else is. They just say we're frightfully lucky here and we've got an exceptional person. I think that to answer the question directly, what can the Speaker do? I think the behaviour in the chair is important, that the Speaker should be courteous to people, should not be seen to intimidate, bully or mimic or mock people. In that way, the Speaker should set a standard of behaviour. Because Parliament is now visible on everyone's screens, I think then people would understand. And then perhaps that might set a slightly different tone in the chamber if the Speaker himself or herself had a quieter and perhaps intervened at shorter length and kept the game going, because the focus should be on the game and not on the referee.
Thank you. Eleanor Smith.
What role should the Speaker of the House have in driving forward improvements in representation in the House, such as recommendation of the Good Parliament report and the Cox's report?
And the Cox's report, I think, was quite difficult for the Speaker. If that was the report which said that the Speaker was somehow involved in the problem, I hope that was the Cox report. That was the Cox report. I've been on the bullying and harassment course. I don't know if members of your committee, Sir Bernard, have. It's a very good course, and I hope that all members of Parliament would attend it and take forward that particular element of the Cox report. And I hope that that in turn would affect in how peers, but more importantly MPs, then manage not just their own staff but staff in the House. I don't know if the Speaker's been on the course, but the Speaker and the Deputy Speakers could set an example by going on the course, commending it to the rest of the House. And then the whips and relevant parties could just gently make inquiries to make sure that people had actually been on the course. And that would send out a signal that on the particular issue that you raised, this was something that Parliament was taking seriously, was driving forward with approval from the top and through the usual channels.
I think I'll talk about the Good Parliament report in a bit, but I think also that the whole sort of the Laura Cox report, one of the things was that it had to apply to everybody or to nobody, and you can't sort of have an exception for the head of everything and to be excluded from being affected by that report. And I think the same goes for the election of the deputy speakers, that you have the deputy speakers are elected at the beginning of every parliament, but the speaker isn't, even though it all came in the same report. And I think that that's something that we really, really ought to address, and in terms of sort of actually putting in place checks and balances for the power of the speaker, I think that that's something that could be done immediately and could be very effective. But I would just say that the speakership shouldn't be uniquely protected from what it affects everybody else in Parliament. On the Good Parliament report, I mean that was the family friendly hours report. And again, I mean I felt very strongly about it at the time, because family friendly hours for one MP are not family friendly hours for another MP. So if you live in Scotland and that's where your family is, then really what you want is you want to be here from Tuesday night till Thursday morning, and then you want to get back home to see your family. And if your family lives in London, then it'd probably be quite nice to have Monday to Friday 9 to 5. So and actually defining what are family friendly hours, I thought was probably the wrong thing to do. And I didn't also think, and this is back to something else, it might be the role of the Speaker to instigate these things, but I think that actually what's happened is that when you look at things like mobile phones and handheld devices in the chamber, or even the UK Youth Parliament sitting in the chamber, these were all things that they either went through the Procedure Committee before they went into the chamber, but they were all voted on by the House and often hotly disputed. Certainly the UK Youth Parliament kind of went deep into the night. And I don't have any problem with any of the decisions that the House takes. What I do have a problem with is when there's sort of an executive decision about the number of amendments on the Queen's speech, or changing the way that SO24 debates are used, or even the politicisation of the role of the speakership to make it more like an American speaker. Again, if that were something that Parliament decided to do, great, but that would be a decision by Parliament to take. Which has gone way off what you've just said, so I'm sorry.
And if you look at the move towards family-friendly hours, that was actually done by the Modernisation Committee from 97 to 01. I think without any involvement from the Speaker at all. It was the government who set up the committee under the leader of the House, who then came to the decision to stop at 7 o'clock and 10 o'clock and to have deferred divisions and not sitting through the night. So that was actually the House doing it, and to reinforce what Natasha's just said, I don't think you need to look necessarily to the Speaker to make those sorts of changes, because the House has shown it's perfectly capable to make them itself if the will is there. And I don't think Michael Martin played any role at all, speaking from memory, in the process of modernisation and the move to family-friendly hours.
Thank you. David Jones.
Yes, as we heard previously, Erskine May has identified the three functions of the Speaker as representing the House, presiding over the House and carrying out administrative duties. To what extent do you think that these functions are still valid, and what changes, if any, do you think need to be made?
Well, I was struck by the answer that Lord Lisvane gave to that particular question, and he, I think, quite rightly made the point that the administrative burden on the Speaker has grown enormously over recent years, with the increasing number of people working in the building and focus on security and the rest. I would need some persuasion that you could divide the staff, the finance and responsibility between the two organisations, the Speaker on the one hand in charge of the Chamber and whoever it is, this elected MP in charge of the Commission and the rest. Because it seems to me that there is an overlap and perhaps some tension between the two. Who would fix the budget?
I don't think you need to divide the administration in that way. It's just a question of who chairs the Commission.
Well, is the Commission going to be exactly the same body at the moment,
Well,
but just chaired by somebody else?
Chaired by somebody else.
Oh, I see.
With the Speaker as an attendee, but not necessarily as chairman.
I thought the question was a much more radical one, following the debate about the clerk, whether the clerk's responsibilities should be split.
Well, I mean,
between
there are many options.
But I think the issue still remains. If the Speaker has responsibility for what goes on in the Chamber, but someone else is chairing the Commission, which is fixing the budget of the House, the staffing of the House, how many clerks you have, how many select committees, I would need to be convinced that the Speaker could discharge his role in the Chamber if he wasn't chairing the Commission, which was responsible for the staffing and the budgetary issues. I think that point would need to be clarified to make sure that there wasn't some tension between the two organisations.
I think also in terms of sort of checks and balances on the Speaker, there are very, very few, and the Commission could be one of those. I think election of by secret ballot of a Speaker at the beginning of every Parliament would be another one. But I certainly think that the role of the Commission is very important, and you know, if there is nothing that can actually sort of put a little bit of pressure on a Speaker, then, you know, but I mean, again, I would agree with George that actually it is something that really does need very careful looking at to see what the unintended consequences are. But also, you know, it all depends on the personalities. You know, if you had somebody who had some sort of power-crazed House of Commons Commission chair, you know, you'd have different problems. So it does depend on who takes on these roles often.
But I think it also comes back to the hustings. I hope when people make a choice, they are aware of the heavy responsibility the Speaker carries as chair of the Commission, and when they vote for a Speaker, they will take on board that is a responsibility they will have to discharge, manage the Commission, to chair the meeting and take at times difficult decisions.
Thank you.
And should these matters be just considered in the normal course of committees and the House's proceedings, or do you think the changes that are being discussed today merit a special select committee like the Straw Committee?
I'm slightly cautious about overreacting to what I think has been a rather unusual speakership. And it may be that with the election of a new Speaker, things revert to what I would call as normal, looking back over 40 years. And so some of the issues that have provoked this inquiry may simply fade away because the new Speaker may interpret the role in a more conventional way that doesn't raise the sharp issues. So I'm against overreacting, and I thought that Lord Lisvane again made some powerful points about potentially undermining the new Speaker by having an inquiry into his role as he or she looks into it. But I wouldn't rule it out downstream, particularly if the new Speaker found that it would be helpful to do this after they'd been in place for 2 or 3 years, just to clarify any outstanding issues where there were some blurred edges.
I mean, I don't agree with that, actually. I think there is... I think this is a really good time, and I think that the election of a new speaker is exactly the perfect time to kind of put pressure on all the candidates to say, look, this would be a really useful exercise, and having a full audit of the powers of the speaker. I mean, it does. I think a lot of things happen behind closed doors, and that a lot of us don't know happens. I mean, there's sort of the way that appointments are made. We haven't really had a chance to discuss that, but in the old days, that was something that would happen through the sort of the clerk route rather than the speaker, and the speaker has now got enormous influence over very senior House appointments, and that's something that the House really ought to have a think about, whether that's the right way to do it, or whether not to do it that way, and actually having an assessment of all the powers, whether formal or informal, that the speakership now has, I think would be a really helpful exercise, because there may be things in there where the House says, oh, actually, this is a brilliant innovation, is really helpful, and in the future could really help the House come to decisions in a different way. Or there may be things where people, when they see what's happening, go, oh, no, this is really not what we want. But again, this should be a decision of the House, and I don't think any new speaker should fear having a proper, detailed sort of scrutiny of what those powers are, and to allow people to decide whether that's what they want. But just in case I haven't made it clear, I think there should be a secret ballot for the new speaker at the beginning of every parliament.
We've got that, but I mean, also, when we say the Speaker is powerful, of course, one of the powers he has is to choose who speaks in debates when he's in the chair, or who he invites to ask a question. And how much do you think members of Parliament are reluctant to scrutinise in public or criticise in public any of the other exercises of the functions of the Speaker, because they feel if they criticise the Speaker, they're going to be the victim of that in the chamber?
Is there any evidence of that actually happening? And isn't actually what might well happen is exactly the opposite? In order to show that there is no bias, the Speaker actually calls people who have criticised him. Is there some evidence? I mean, I've been out of the place for 4 years, but isn't there some evidence of that?
I think there is, but I also think there's an awful lot of fear.
I mean, the way that the Speaker calls, the way that MPs are called to speak in debates has changed dramatically. I mean, I remember, even, I haven't served as long as many people here, but, even in 2005, when, because I didn't know how things work, tried to lobby the Speaker to call me in a question, got a really stinking letter from the Speaker's secretary saying that the Speaker will not be lobbied. And in those days, the Speaker would not want to know what an MP wanted to say for fear of prejudicing the debate. And these days, MPs are kind of encouraged to submit great long essays in order to say what it is that they want to say, and, their suitability for taking part early on in the debate, which, I'm not saying this happens, but it would give the chair the ability to choreograph the debate, finish on a high note, finish on a low note, if that's what they wanted to do. And that's new. That didn't happen before. Certainly not in my early days.
Well, actually, I remember my father telling me how George Young used to make statements from the chair saying, please stop writing me notes that you want to be called in the debates. It's a decision for me.
George Thomas.
Yes, George Thomas.
You said George Young.
Sorry, George Thomas. too many Georges. I apologise. But anyway, thank you very much for a most interesting and refreshing session. I really enjoyed to see you both. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thanks very much.
And our next panel, please. Thank you very much. Inevitably, we're running behind with 3 panels in front of the committee today. Very grateful you're all joining us. Please could you identify yourselves for the record?
I'm Ruth Fox. I'm Director of the Hansard Society.
Philip Norton, Lord Norton of Louth, Professor of Government at the University of Hull.
Hannah White, I'm Deputy Director of the Institute for Government.
And another former clerk from the House Service. But very interested in all your perspectives. Can I just start by asking each of you to comment on the role and main functions of the Speaker and how that's changed over the years, if we've got anything to add to the previous sessions. Hannah White.
I fear I did not hear the whole of the first
session. I appreciate
session.
that. That's why I thought I'd let you go first.
So forgive me if I'm repetitious. I mean, I think we all are aware of the Erskine May setting out the main roles. I would have said in terms of developments recently, clearly the current Speaker has put a greater emphasis on his external role and a sort of educational role, going out and talking about Parliament in schools and so on externally throughout the House. I think, do you want me to go into the question about how it's changed?
Yes.
And sort of conflicts between the roles that you...
The two or three most significant changes that you've seen.
So I think that's one of them. I think the second is the sort of change in the external environment in which the Speaker is operating. So the fact that of digital communications, social media growing, there's greater pressure on the House of Commons, I think, to be relevant and topical. And I think that the current Speaker has responded to that by granting more urgent questions. There also with the right committee reforms, which made some changes in terms of having topical questions and so on. But I think members are more conscious of this. Members, when they speak in the chamber, are more conscious of what they might be able to then do with that on social media, and that affects their relationship with the chair and wanting to be called and so on. Then I think the obvious thing, which I'm sure has come up in the previous sessions, is about the current political context and minority government or coalition government. Over the period of the last speakership, we've had a lot of more focus on Parliament and what's happened in Parliament due to the political outcomes of elections, which have, I think, put additional pressure on the role of the chair.
I take the three roles, but I express them differently in terms of understanding the way the office has changed and the challenges it presently faces. And you can relate that, if you like, to three domains, almost physically, if you think about it, or three concentric circles. The centre one is actually the chamber. The second one is the parliamentary estate encompassing the House of Commons, and the third is the world beyond Westminster. And each of those, in relation to those, it requires different skills. So if you think about the first one in terms of the chamber, the Speaker is in effect, I think the best way to characterise it, is a ringmaster, not necessarily in terms of a circus, but more a wrestling ring. The second is you require someone who's a strategic leader, not simply administration. It's actually thinking about where you need to go, how you devise the resources to deliver. And the third is the public face of the House of Commons, that external world. So for each of those, you require particular skills, and it's a question of whether you can find an individual who can combine those skills. And if you look at the speakers that you've had, they've dealt with it in different ways, because there's a relationship between the first and the third, but some are focused on one rather than the other. So if you think about since the cameras have come in, some speakers have essentially been inward-looking. Their focus is on the chamber, and so the cameras have been watching what they've been doing within the chamber. So, I mean, Bernard Wetherill, Michael Martin were essentially inward-looking. Others more outward-looking, that outward face of Parliament. So Betty Boothroyd, John Bercow, more concerned with the public appearance. So a lot does depend upon the individual. But as I say, you've got those three roles, which are very different. Each requires particular skills. There may be some overlap. And that does then throw up the question that was mentioned earlier, whether to some extent you separate them out and might need someone to chair the Commission, more in the strategic leadership role, rather than leaving it to the Speaker.
Dr. Fox.
I mean, I broadly agree with what's been said. I think probably some of the biggest changes, other than the sort of public engagement role, are in relation to the administrative aspects of the Speaker's responsibilities. And that's in the context of the changing nature of the world we live in. So HR functions, finance functions, the regulatory context, freedom of information. All of these things create a very different environment for this speaker and the next speaker than was true 10, 15, 20 years ago. And that requires a different skill set than perhaps we needed in a speaker previously. And therefore that does raise the question about whether or not you can get that broad range of skills in the one person. It may be that you can, but if you can't, then it creates a difficulty. And I think one of the questions is whether there is too much focus on administration as opposed to strategic thinking about the challenges facing Parliament. To give you one example of how I've sort of looked at the Brexit political process over the last couple of years, it was very clear from the outset that the handling of Brexit and the pressures that it would pose for the House, for Parliament collectively, but for the House particularly, were going to be very, very challenging. And whilst there have been changes in terms of the resource function, in terms of staffing, in terms of expert legal support and so on behind the scenes, there's been fairly minimal institutional change within the House, other than things like the Brexit Committee and European Statutory Instruments Committee. And if you compare it with sort of in the aftermath of the devolution legislation, where there was a procedure committee inquiry into how the consequences of devolution would be handled, at the outset, didn't have anything similar following the referendum. And I think part of that, there could have been a degree of strategic thinking at the outset, some kind of forum to bring together the different parties, the different players in the process, to think that through. Now, an argument could be whether that should come from the liaison committee or it should come from the procedure committee or whatever, but it seems to me the Speaker could perform that function in the way that, for example, the Lord Speaker does to some degree through the Lord Speaker's advisory groups that he utilises, or previous female speakers have utilised, to deal with strategic, challenging questions that face the House.
Thank you. David Jones.
Lord Norton's touched on this, but what would the panel say have been the principal changes in the role of the Speaker since the proceedings of the Commons were first broadcast both on radio and on television?
Well, I think the cameras coming in, you could take it even a decade further back, 78, when you had the permanent sound broadcasting. There was that greater visibility, so the voice of the Speaker was heard, and then of course with the entry of the cameras became a visible feature. But then I wouldn't underplay either the move from the Speaker wearing a wig, which depersonalised the individual, to not wearing the wig, so it became more of the person people recognised who's in the chair, and there's more of a public performance. So one sees more the Speaker, so that facilitates, I think, the role of the visible aspect of the House. But I think much more important are the challenges that are faced in terms of the other things that Dr. Fox was touching upon, in the demands there now are and the challenges that are faced by the House, as was mentioned. But you've got security, you've got the Cox report, you've got enforcing the will of the House, the issue now of privilege being touched upon as well. Devolution and interparliamentary relations, I think, are important as well. And then, which ties in with your question, perceptions of the House. The Commons have got greater visibility at the moment, but not in a positive way. So Brexit has thrown up problems in terms of conduct in the House, how the Speaker's handled it. But there's also that wider public perception, which has led to a collapse in public trust in the House of Commons, which is reflected in the audit of political engagement undertaken by the Hansard Society. I think that is a very serious problem for the House. Before, people did not trust MPs. Now they do not trust the House of Commons. So I think that's a real challenge to the institution, and it's how one responds to that. And the Speaker clearly, I think, does have a very strategic role.
And just picking up on that, I think there's not just a question about trust in Parliament, there's also a question about trust within Parliament, which has broken down to a certain extent. This is in most recent years. And trust is a really important force within government, Parliament, as you all know, in terms of getting things done in Parliament. things can't all be done by the rules, things have to be done by agreements, by the usual channels and so on. But I think that some of what we're seeing is some of that breaking down and that making it harder to come to agreements in ways that are not on the record through the proceedings that happen in the House, preferably legislation and so on and so forth. So I think it's not just a question about rebuilding trust in the House. The next speaker is going to have to think about rebuilding trust within the House. I also want to pick up on the point that Ruth made about the Commission as a sort of has been sort of my interpretation of what she was saying is sort of better at the tactical stuff than the strategic stuff. So they have a whole host of tactical decisions sent to them, but that the time it takes for them to handle those means it's hard for them to do the more strategic work. And in my view, it would be much better to delegate all the administration stuff to the executive board of officials, all the HR stuff. Some members are very expert in these things, but most members do not come into the House to run the organisation of the House. They come to represent their constituents and do those things, and they're not necessarily qualified to do those things. The executive board are. If you delegated more formally and obviously those responsibilities to the executive board, that would free up the Commission to look at these strategic questions. And I think Ruth has identified this question about what could have been done, and I absolutely agree, in the early stages of Brexit to prepare the House for all the expertise and resources it would need to really do a good job with the Brexit process. But I think there's now also a gaping hole in the planning that's going on to think about Parliament's role after Brexit, all the new responsibilities, all the challenges the House will face. And actually there's a definite case for a Speaker setting up a group to think about, there will be different questions decided and discussed in different committees, including your own, but someone to take a strategic overview and what resources the House will need going forward to take on some of these new roles and responsibilities, I think is really, really important. And that's the sort of thing the Speaker ought to be doing in terms of administration.
Very good. Ruth Fox.
I think I'd probably only add to that in terms of whether or not you completely take away any political accountability in terms of the administration. I'd want to think about that a bit more. I'd have some concerns, I think, about completely separating it. But if there were to be a review, I think it's not just about the role of the Speaker in this, in terms of the governance. That's part of it. But I think if it purely became about that, then it would clearly be seen as a sort of not a knee-jerk reaction, but a reaction to the experience of the last few years. And as previous people who've given evidence have said, the experience under the new Speaker might be quite different because they will bring a different approach, different skills, different experience to it, and they'll also want to reflect on their role in light of the critique of the last 10 years. But there's a broader sort of governance question going back to the implications of the Straw Report. Has that review delivered what was expected in terms of the reorganisation of the structures? Has the Director General's report delivered the kind of internal changes that were expected and hoped for? And if not, why not? So I think if there is to be a governance review, and there may well be a case for it in the next year or so, but I think it has to be broader than just the Speaker's role.
Excellent. Mr. Jones, again.
Yes, in the relationship between the House and the government, to what extent is and should the Speaker be an advocate for the House?
I don't know what's already been said on this. It seems to me that a lot of the decisions that are made by the Speaker involve the government making representations about what they would like to happen in the House, and the Speaker being required to interpret that and to take a view on that in light of the rules and the rulings and the standing orders and all the accreted utterances from the House about how it thinks it wants to run itself. So I think it's, to some extent, it would seem to me, inevitable that is the Speaker, you can say that's the Speaker taking the side of the House, but that is the House, that is the Speaker considering what the government is proposing in that context. And I think that in those discussions about what should happen on the floor of the House, that there isn't anyone else speaking for the House in that conversation. So it's, as far as I'm aware, so would be my take.
No, I'd agree with that, because if it's for representations made by the Speaker, it's up to the Speaker to interpret what he regards as the best interest of the House. I mean, you could separate out the role of the Speaker in facilitating the expression of the will of the House, and then separate from that, interpreting, as far as he can, the will of the House. And it's difficult when representations are being made, but it has to have regard to the best interests of the House. Now, that's probably easier, and it may come on to a later question. It's easier when what was referred to earlier as normal circumstances. If you've got two large parties, majority government, you're facilitating the normal dictum that the government's entitled to get its business, but the opposition's entitled to be heard. Erskine May is basically based on two sides facing one another, so if you've got that, you know how to operate. But once you get into a situation where you've got minority government or lots of third parties, because it's difficult to incorporate those in terms of the rules of the House, and then political controversy, where you've clearly got conflict, which is in unusual circumstances because the majority has been determined by a transient majority, then that throws up all sorts of problems that we've not encountered before.
I think I would agree with that. I would simply add in there's also the factor of the relationship between the Speaker and the Leader of the House, which I think was touched on earlier. And the Leader of the House is also supposed to be a champion of the House, but how that evidences itself, how that is given effect, potentially has an impact on the degree to which the Speaker may have to be a more forceful advocate for the House in terms of the balance in the way that what after all is the government minister, how they carry out their role, and that can vary again, very dependent on the political situation and the personal character of the Leader of the House and how they see their job. And obviously, Erskine May sets out some, what you might sort of say, some hard powers, if you like, in terms of the Speaker's responsibilities, in terms of being the advocate for the House, and in terms of enforcing sanctions, legal sanctions, and so on. But there's also the references to what you might call soft power advocacy aspects of the Speaker's role, in terms of representing to the government, for example, if questions are not being answered in a timely way, or select committee reports are not being responded to, and so on. And that might be a very private discussion, but this nonetheless can see the Speaker playing quite a useful role, but is dependent upon quite heavily on personalities.
And could I just add to that? I mean, it's worth bearing in mind the unique situation that the Commons faces, given the point that's just been made, in terms of speaking for the House, because the House is a unique entity in that it is the sum of its parts. It's the members coming together. You've got a Speaker, you've got a Leader of the House, but no one who can necessarily always speak for the House. The Speaker in certain circumstances, and then you'd have to distinguish between interpreting the will of the House and taking the Speaker's view what's in the interests of the House. But there is no one person who can necessarily speak for the House on all occasions, because there is not necessarily a view that would enjoy unanimity among the members. That creates problems in terms of perceived leadership. It creates problems in speaking to the public, because who is formally designated, who can claim they speak for the House on some of the challenges that it faces. So some of that is, I think, unique to the nature of the institution. I mean, there's no one can speak for Parliament because it's two separate institutions, each of which is the sum of its parts. It throws up serious problems when you have a lack of trust in the institution, because the institution cannot be agile and very quick in responding to some of those pressures, especially when they're immediate.
If it is the role of the Speaker to enforce the will of the House, would you say the Speaker has sufficient powers? And could you also touch upon the point made by Ms. Natasha Engel about the issue of the will of the people, which may not always align with the will of the House? And I'm thinking about the current circumstances, of course, in particular.
Well, do you want to do with the enforcement, or?
So in terms of powers that the Speaker does he have enough? I mean, or too many, but is the balance right? I mean, I think one of the questions I was thinking about in relation to this is about the power of recall of the House, which obviously in the Lords it's more open to the Lord Speaker to recall the House of Lords. We had questions about this. We have had questions about this in numerous contexts in recent years, and so that is one thing which I would simply draw attention to, the difference between the situation in the Commons and in the Lords. And there was a question as to if, for example, a certain proportion of members had requested a recall, whether it ought to be open to the Speaker to recall the House, and not only up to he could only do it on the basis of a government request, which, as you know, is the current situation. I've forgotten the second part of the question.
Public.
Will of the people versus will of the House. I think, in my view, the Speaker's role must be to interpret what he sees as the will of the House. I think in the current situation which you're referring to, it's for the government to take account of the referendum that happened and to decide how it thinks the legitimacy of that result should play into the government's policy, which it's obviously done. And then I think it's for individual members to decide how they think they should act and make decisions and vote, reflecting their view of the legitimacy of that result and how their constituents voted. So I think my view is that for the Speaker has to think about the House as a whole. As Lord Norton's pointed out, in this context, it's a particularly challenging task because whereas normally you would have the two main parties and the smaller parties, and the Speaker, as always, would be balancing what he understood to be the priorities and motivations and wishes of those different parties within the House. There are actually lots of different alliances and groupings and things which have come in the context of Brexit which don't align with those normal groups in the House, and that, I think, has made the decision-making process probably more complicated.
I'd agree with all of that. On the first point about enforcement, the Speaker, I think, has got quite sufficient powers in terms of enforcement within the House. There's a wider issue that's been touched upon, for example, in regard to recall, and then there's a wider issue for the House which goes way beyond the Speaker in terms of privilege and enforcing the will of House in terms of witnesses appearing before committees, and that currently throws up all sorts of issues where the Speaker would have a role, but I think that's a wider issue that really does need addressing. That's now, I think, becoming a more serious matter. On the issue of in relation to the public, I think the Speaker has to be not cognizant of anything beyond the House. I mean, he's both the servant and master within the House. Now, the Speaker might have a role in speaking for the House to the public. I don't think he's got a role the other way round. All he can regard, I think, is that the public will is the aggregate of the views as taken by the members of the House, how they interpret it. I really don't think the Speaker can set himself up against that, so that his role, if there is a more wider view, I say it's the view of the House expressed to the public, but not necessarily on public issues. It's actually that point about what the House does and helping people understand its role, rather than himself having any comment on the substance of public policy.
I'd only add to that, of course, this is the conflict between sort of direct and representative democracy, and I agree with Lord Norton. It is not the job of the Speaker to interpret the will of the people, but we have had a general election since the referendum, and the Prime Minister went to the country asking for a mandate and a majority and didn't get it. And the Speaker is left to contend in the House with the consequences of that in terms of minority government. And the question that it seems to me then gives rise to is whether the special privileges in the standing orders that are accorded to government ministers should be the same in a minority government situation as they are in a majority government situation. And one of the difficulties that this Speaker has particularly had to contend with, and to some degree also true in the 1970s, is dealing with all of that in the context of party structures not quite operating in the House in the way that they have in the past, 100-odd members who do not belong to one of the two main parties, very senior politicians recently in Cabinet now sitting as independents. I mean, the complexity of all of that in terms of deciding who should speak when, which amendments should be chosen, is a challenge, a political challenge that other recent speakers have not had to face.
Okay. Kelvin Hopkins, may I just make a little plea? I think we have to go a little bit faster, otherwise we're going to run out of time. So, short questions, short answers. Thank you.
Thank you. I mean, to an extent you've touched on this already, but I'll ask this. In the past decade, we have had mainly coalition and minority government. If non-majority government is to become more prevalent, does the role of the Speaker need to adapt, or is the role of the Speaker different in these circumstances?
Well, I think I've touched on that.
Yeah,
I would add one suggestion, if I may, in that I think it would have been helpful to this Speaker. I think it would be helpful to future speakers, given the political context we are in and the little evidence that is likely to change in the coming years, that a regular review, formal review of the collective body of standing orders would be helpful. So to give you an example, the Fixed Term Parliaments Act, I don't think that's had an impact on the House yet, but could in the context of if there is a vote of no confidence. Similarly, there was talk some months ago, however unlikely it may have been, that if there had been a breakaway within the Labour Party, we could have seen a scenario where a group of parliamentary Labour members was greater than the numbers under the leadership of the leader of the opposition. Situation in those circumstances would have raised some quite difficult political challenges for the Speaker, because so much of standing orders and the role of the leader of the opposition is defined in relation to legal definitions of political parties and situations in regard to what is set out in statute as well as the standing orders. And I think we could, if that had happened, however unrealistic it may, in the light of day, have turned out to be, if those scenarios had come to fruition, the Speaker would have effectively had to make some quite difficult decisions on the hoof because there's no guide. And one of the things that I find quite interesting is that there's only been 6 formal reviews of the standing orders since 1945, only one of them at behest of the House, and that was Lord Lisvane. And it seems to me that the House could benefit from having a committee or a rules committee or something that periodically looked at them, particularly to deal with circumstances when procedural changes are implied by new pieces of legislation. Because if that is not picked up, then the Speaker is left to make it up on the hoof as and when the circumstances arise, and then we can't be surprised that some of these decisions may prove to be controversial and difficult.
Very quickly. I think the key point to make is the unique situation we're in, which is a particular issue overlaying a minority government. We've had minority governments before, there's something to be learned from that, but there's a key constitutional point we have to bear in mind. The government is a distinct entity separate from a majority of the House. So even if the government's in a minority, it is the government. And basically our whole constitutional structure since the Glorious Revolution has been based on the government coming forward with proposals for public policy to which the House of Commons then responds.
And extremely quickly, I just think we have to all be careful about our language, because we talk about what's normal and what's unique and what's special, and as this question, as you frame it, suggests, it may well be that we're not going back to an era of large majorities in the House of Commons. It's absolutely the case that we should think about what that could mean and think about how procedures need to be adapted to enable the House to work effectively in that context.
I think you've answered my other 2 questions, which are about clarity for parliamentary procedure and also the Fixed Term Parliaments Act. So perhaps we can move on.
Thank you very much. Eleanor Smith.
What is the role of the Speaker in finding the balance between facilitating minority voices and ensuring the progress of government's business?
I mean, I think those are two of the very important principles amongst a whole host of principles that any speaker has to bear in mind when making decisions. And I think it's difficult to... I think that the answer to your question is situational. In any different context, the speaker is going to have to think about what the balance needs to be, where the government has strong control over time. For example, through the passage of legislation, the Speaker will want to make sure that sufficient debate is had so that minorities can express their views, but will also want to make sure that the government can get its business. In other contexts, there might be House business proposed by a minority group within the House, but where the Speaker would want to make sure that there was a response from the government in order to make that a meaningful proceeding of the House. So I think it's really hard to say anything concrete unless you can look at the specifics. And this is the whole point, I think, about the role of the Speaker, is that their role is always going to be necessary to have someone who's making a judgment on these things. There are too many different rules and principles and everything to be taken into account to say, that you could codify this to any extent that you could really remove that role. It's always going to need to be there.
I reinforce that, because I think the normal situation is you proceed on the basis the government's entitled to get its business, the opposition's entitled to be heard. That's now complicated because one would have to say the oppositions are entitled to be heard, and sometimes the combination of the oppositions creates a majority. So the Speaker's therefore got to handle with the difficult situation. I agree very much with what's just been said. You can review the rules to some extent to take that into account, but essentially it's quite a dynamic situation, so you need, whoever the Speaker is, to have some discretion to be able to adapt to the circumstances and try to be fair to all those involved, because, as I say, the balance will change.
I agree with what's said, so in the interest of time I won't add anything.
Thank you very much. Ronnie Cowan.
Is the office of a Speaker accountable enough? If so, to whom?
Well, the accountability issue is obviously ultimately accountable to members. If members disliked something sufficiently, then a motion of the House criticising them, whatever, could be moved. Of course, we know the challenge of that is if the Speaker has done something that attracts the support of the House and there isn't a majority to censure him or whatever, then that, I'm afraid, is the reality of the situation. There have been other Speakers who have taken contentious decisions that the government of the day, for example, didn't like. This Speaker is not unusual in that. And in those circumstances, 1976, the shipbuilding hybridity bill decision of, I think it was Speaker George Thomas, yes. That ruling was subsequently, a government motion was laid that basically made clear that they didn't wish that precedent to be acknowledged for the future. So the sense that the precedent was set aside by a decision of the House. Again, that could be the decision of the House if members wished it. They could pass a similar motion, but there is not a majority for it.
I think it's very important that one doesn't start to create too many limits on the Speaker, because then members will exploit them for their own benefit. So the Speaker is constrained. The House could censure the Speaker through motion, and ultimately, of course, the Speaker comes up for re-election at the start of each Parliament. So there is a constraint there, and this does allow me, Mr. Chairman, to make the point that the last Speaker to be removed by the House was not Sir John Trevor at the end of the 17th century, which everybody keeps quoting. It was Sir Charles Manners Sutton in 1835, and before that, Sir Fletcher Norton. No relation. So it is possible. But in a way, that removal of Manners Sutton marked, I think, the pivotal point in the change of the nature of the role, because before then, speakers had been moving to be more impartial, but they weren't necessarily apolitical, and sometimes they went on to hold government office. And Manners Sutton, who had a record for the number of parliamentaries re-elected, but was also considered a potential Prime Minister. So that was the last. And since then, you've moved from a practice to a convention that whoever is the Speaker, ceasing to be Speaker, retires from the House, is offered a peerage, is seen as neutral. And really since then, the practice of being detached has become developed. So you need to protect that. And as I say, you then start to create, say, rules that would allow the House to limit the Speaker, make it easier to challenge the Speaker, I think that becomes problematic, because then members try to use whatever rules are at their disposal for political purposes. So the Speaker needs to be protected to some extent. The House does have the ultimate power of removal.
A quick point about sort of power and accountability, and I think it refers to something you were saying at the end of the last session. You can look at the adequacy of mechanisms to hold people to account, but you've also always got to think about the power dynamics that operate within those. Will people hold someone to account if they then have power over them, and what they are able to do? So I think that's, looking at these things neutrally doesn't necessarily give you the full picture. I also think previous two answers focus mostly on the accountability of the Speaker for his decisions in the Chamber. I think there are large improvements that could be made around the transparency of what goes on in the House of Commons Commission and accountability for decisions made there. The minutes are very brief. It's very hard to know what goes on, and there's a lot more that could be said about that, and that would enable people to hold the Speaker to account for his or her role within that.
Thank you.
Well, I think it's a wider issue, because that's holding the Commission to account, which the Speaker happens to chair, and I think that is an important role that does need reviewing.
Indeed.
David Jones, very important.
Yes, if public trust in politics generally has declined, to what extent is it the role of the Speaker to seek to restore it?
Well, Lord Norton's already alluded to the results of the last audit of political engagement. And it's true that public knowledge and interest in politics and Parliament has increased, but perceptions of it and perceptions of politics and politicians generally has declined. And I think, I'm not sure that I'm always slightly wary of utilising the trust argument, because I think it's trust your MP to do what, trust Parliament to do what. I think it's more about accountability and competence. And the Speaker, I think, by virtue of the prominence of his role, particularly in the context of sort of 24/7 media, social media and so on, and the fact that there is no other recognisable single figure that the public would identify with or be able to identify, other than some prominent members of the front benches, the Speaker has a role to play in that. And clearly things like Prime Minister's questions, which are the 30-second clip that play on the evening news, how PMQs looks and feels to the public influences public perceptions, because a lot of what they get, their perceptions, is gleaned from television as much as any other form of media still. So the Speaker has a role to play in that, in terms of how behaviour and conduct and culture of the House plays out. But I think we've got to be realistic. I mean, the idea that the Speaker alone can take on the challenge of restoring the reputation of the institution of MPs collectively, of politics generally, is an impossible job. And no matter how much money is spent by this House on the excellent education and outreach programmes and so on, all of that can be wrecked in a day or an evening, which of the kind that we saw a few weeks ago, where the negative response to what happened was so acute. The education programmes and the outreach are not really, in balance, able to counter that. So I think the Speaker has a role to play, but I think we have to be careful of placing too high an expectation on what it is that they as one individual can achieve. But clearly they can set the cultural tone, and the leadership tone is important.
Can I reinforce that? I agree absolutely with that. The Speaker can only do so much. If you think about it, the powers of the Speaker are in relation to conduct within the chamber, both how the Speaker behaves in the chamber, so there's the public perception of that. The Speaker can do a lot in terms of encouragement, facilitating public engagement, informing outside about the House, encouraging the facilities to do that. So that's very important. You could argue it's necessary. It is not sufficient, and the Speaker can't be really involved in the input side, and be involved in the output, disseminating what's going on in Parliament, raising awareness. But on the input side, it's going to have to be more members themselves in terms of their engagement and taking on board what the public are saying and thinking about the means by which you do that. So you've now got e-petitioning, which is proving quite popular. It's whether the House can do other things like that. So you can't really just rely on the Speaker. It's the House as a whole that's got to take responsibility for its own conduct and think about how it hears from citizens. Members are very good at, on the whole, at hearing locally from constituents. As Lord Young was mentioning, people distinguish between the local MP and the House of Commons, the collectivity of members. They see them in very different perceptions. But you can't sort of put the responsibility on the Speaker alone when the responsibility lies with members themselves and the collectivity of members. So it's up to the House itself to do something to encourage, to really restore public trust. Because coming back to a point I made earlier, the Speaker is not in a position to speak for the House of Commons when it comes to the substance of what it's actually doing.
If the Speaker himself or herself doesn't always set the best example, then their authority, as an example, is going to be impaired, and their invocations to the House to behave better are not going to be taken very seriously.
It depends very much, I think, on the individual
Yes.
in the chair. Coming back to the
Dr.
earlier
White?
question, of course, it's much more transparent now in terms of the cameras being in on the chamber, so people can see who the Speaker is. Before the entry of the cameras, you had a fairly anonymous... People outside would not recognise the Speaker, and if they were in the gallery, of course, the Speaker was bewigged. You wouldn't recognise the Speaker outside that
Dr.
context.
White.
Now you do, so it is very important. Had the cameras been in before much earlier speakers, you may have had some speakers not being in the chair very long.
Dr. White.
I agree with you. What the Speaker can do is set the tone from the top. Obviously, the Speaker has a role in ordering the chamber, but I think every elected member of Parliament and every person who thinks that Parliament is a useful and valuable institution needs to think what they personally can do to promote trust in the system.
I absolutely agree. The message comes from the top, but the top is the Prime Minister. And if the members of Parliament and the Prime Minister are prepared to behave the way they sometimes do within the chamber, then it's wrong of us as elected MPs to point the finger solely at the Speaker in the chair.
I'm not. I'm saying it's the Speaker and the Prime Minister.
But
and
we're
all
talking.
of you.
The issue here we have is caught in horse and cart here. Which is going to come first? If members are not prepared to behave in a respectful fashion in the chamber, and PMQs, as was highlighted earlier, is an appalling disgrace. Should there be more discipline allowed from the Speaker? Because as far as I can see, all he can say is ignore you or chuck you out. Are there more rules that have to be applied there so members of Parliament can work within a discipline that they understand and they respect?
Why do you take that?
Well, I mean, certainly the Speaker is responsible for conduct in the chambers. That applies to ministers appearing in the chamber. I mean, I distinguish it. There's a distinction drawn between the conduct of ministers and, if you like, the conduct of government being responsible for public policy. But obviously, ministers in the chamber, it's the Speaker who is in charge of conduct, whether you're a minister or a humble or not so humble backbencher.
If I may just
very briefly.
Very, very quickly, when we did our report on PMQs a few years ago, we suggested that there might be a case for a sort of an interim or a middle way sanction for the Speaker, so that it's not completely thrown off the estate for the entire day, but a bit like a sort of sin bin in sport. You're thrown out of the chamber for that PMQ session. You're just removed, but that doesn't necessarily have knock-on effects on your participation in the rest of the day's business, because I think that does influence what the Speaker does and when.
Maybe having your right to vote revoked for a few days would work, given the pressure then be put on you by your own whips, given that we've got a hung Parliament here. Would be a more
it's an incentivisation scheme.
And give the sergeant an arm to
Moving
swap
on.
the sword.
Eleanor Smith.
Yes, thank you. What role should the Speaker of the House have in driving forward improvements in representation in the House, such as the recommendation from the Good Parliament report?
So I think this is another instance of where the House struggles to push forward reforms because it doesn't have any one person who can just take a decision and move things forward. I was struck at an event we had at the Institute for Government a couple of weeks ago with candidates for Speaker, and one of them just said, well, you know, it's just a failure of leadership that the Cox recommendations haven't been fully recommended and implemented, and if I was Speaker, I would just do it. And it seemed to me a radical oversimplification of the situation, because the Speaker cannot do this stuff alone. There are lots of different bodies within the House of Commons that have an interest, and that is why the House tends to be reactionary, tends to only make incremental changes, except in sort of very sort of crisis situations. And that is why, in my understanding, some of these things haven't happened more quickly, because as Lord Norton said, an organisation which is the sum of its parts, but it is more of an organism, I think, than, as somebody's probably said, I'm sure that's not an original thought of mine, than an organisation. And there isn't just a person at the top, and certainly not the Speaker, who can make this happen. But I think the Speaker can show leadership on this. I think that the Speaker's reference group, which has been in place to try to implement the Good Parliament recommendations of the Good Parliament report, has been important in trying to leverage the sort of will from the Speaker to try to make that happen. It's probably achieved more than the Speaker alone would have been able to do. I think it is really important for the sort of leadership and will to come from the Speaker on these things, also for him or her to model the sorts of behaviours that those reports call for, to show that they personally are held to the same standards as every other member and a member of staff of the House, and to call out behaviour that they see as inappropriate in all contexts. I think one of the main things that the next Speaker could do, which would actually address many of the points that have come up today, is address the culture of undue deference which exists, both to the Speaker but also on some occasions, in other contexts within the House. The fact that the House is quite hierarchical actually facilitates some of the behaviours and some of the attitudes and some of the lack of progress that we've seen on diversity and so on, that I think those reports say that we should challenge.
Could I reinforce that and just draw attention as well, following Lord Young, some of the things that happens in the Lords, because the Lords is far more a house of peers. Everybody's far more equal, certainly in terms of membership. But just to pick up on what was said and what was mentioned earlier, I think there's a clear role for the Commission. The point made earlier is distinguishing between administration and strategic leadership, so not just resting on the Speaker. The Speaker could drive the Commission, and also picking up on the earlier point about the Commission itself being more transparent and accountable to the House. But the Commission could take on the role of the strategic leadership, so you're identifying where do you want to be in 5-10 years' time in delivering on the Cox report and so on. How do we get from here to there, and then drive it to achieve it, and being answerable to the House for that? So really it should be a body like the Commission, rather than just relying on the occupant of the chair or the Speaker as chair of the Commission. The Commission itself should be, I think, a driving force for that. That strategic leadership, I think, is vital to deliver on what you're identifying.
Can I just quickly pick up on that point, because I thought it was really notable when the House of Commons Commission came out in response to the Laura Cox report, and it was very welcome indeed that the response was to say we accept these recommendations. But what followed was then, and we hope that the House will implement them. And I just thought that was a complete cop-out, because actually the Commission knows full well that unless somebody takes leadership on that and says, and here are the responsibilities and here are the accountabilities, it's not going to happen. And it was very good at diffusing the kind of concern that the media had around the issue at the time, but it was really disingenuous, because the Commission could say, oh yes, we sign up to these things, and have no intention. And this is just of driving it forward in a meaningful way. And that's just one example, I think, that we have before us of how the Commission is not an effective body.
Anything to add? No, thank you very much. I think the points about the Cox report are very important, and we take them very seriously. Just to wrap this up, we've been discussing all morning whether the chairmanship of the Commission should be divided from the speakership, and that was a recommendation of Lord Lisvane, but there are mixed views on the subject. Anything to add to that debate? Dr. White?
I think that one of the non-executive members of the Commission should chair it.
I beg your pardon?
One of the non-executive members of the Commission should chair it. And then that would balance better the interests of the Speaker and the Leader and then the backbench members. And I also think that the backbench members of the Commission ought to be elected by the House.
So the board should choose its own chairman, and it should not be the Speaker?
No, so there are, my understanding is, non-executive members of the House of Commons Commission too,
right,
who are appointed external, like lay members, and that one of those should take the chair.
But Lord Lisvane's proposal is that the chair should be an elected member of Parliament who is elected by the House.
Then I differ from him.
Okay, that's fine.
Well, I don't have a view on that. My view would be that this very issue is something that we usefully referred. So rather than some grand committee looking at the wider issue of the speakership, I think there are various adjustments that could be considered by this committee or by the procedure committee, such as the role of the Commission and who should chair it. There are points that could be considered, particularly by procedure, picking up on Lord Young's point, not least about the Speaker's list, which I think would prove rather popular with members. So there, and would also deal with any problems to accusations of bias against the Speaker, and it would limit the powers of the Speaker. So there are various proposals for change I think could be considered, but in a more measured way and by a committee such as this or procedure that would help drive things forward, but without raising the temperature and making it a sort of grand issue. Yeah.
I would want to think about Hannah's proposal for independent members. I hadn't thought on those lines, so I'd want to think about the governance implications of that. My thinking had been that if not the Speaker, then it should be another member of the House, and I agree that I do think there'd be advantages in those members being elected. My concern about the Commission is that you have the sort of the leader, the shadow leader, and the Lib Dem shadow leader, and so on, and they have a whole range of other responsibilities. And their focus is not on some of these sort of administrative and strategic questions. And I think being able to see it as almost a sort of like a select committee role in and of itself, with very, very distinct responsibilities and focus, buttressed by an electoral process, might be helpful.
I agree.
And just a very quick point, my understanding is that it is not infrequently the case that meetings of the Commission have to be delayed or moved because of the duties of the Speaker in the House. So if he were not in the chair, then that wouldn't be such a problem.
But it begs the question whether it is the present Commission is truly a board or whether it is a group of stakeholders. Yes. And while you might have a body of stakeholders somewhere in the system, perhaps even above the board, there needs to be a proper board with collective fiduciary responsibility that will see things in a united sort of way. Yeah. So you, Lord Norton, think it should be, these matters should be looked at, I would suggest, not wishing to sound derogatory, but in a fairly ad hoc way by existing committees of the House. What do you think about having another straw-type committee where the House would vest a committee with the authority to make recommendations about all these matters, and perhaps broader than the role of the Speaker, with a remit that the House itself has chosen?
Well, I can see the arguments for having a distinct committee, not least for reasons that were touched upon in earlier evidence, particularly if it's going beyond the Speaker. So you're not looking at the speakership, but if you like, looking at the strategic leadership of the House of Commons, where the House wants to be 5-10 years' time. How do you deliver on all these priorities? If it was looking in those broad terms, then I think there's a value in it, because it might also engage members of the House and get them thinking about it.
Thank you.
If you just focus on the speakership, you're in danger of becoming too political. People focus on the individual, and you really need to be thinking about the House more generally and its role and reputation.
Anything to add on that? And the timing? When should this be done?
I agree with the fact that there's a danger at the end of a speakership of a review like this looking personal.
Yes.
If it's about the role of the Speaker per se. I think that previous governance reviews haven't done enough to think about the role of the Commission and the top part of House of Commons governance, and often that's because it's really difficult to find someone who can run a review like that, who understands those things and the dynamics, but doesn't have some kind of vested interest or perspective so that they can seem to be objective to do it. So it's quite a difficult ask, but I agree that that is the... if you're going to do it, that would be the way to do it. I think it would be a little unfair on an incoming Speaker to be coming in just as they're wanting to shape their role, and every Speaker, approaches the role differently, to say, well, actually, you're going to sort of have to hang fire on anything you do for the next however long it takes for a committee which is going to tell you how to do your job to report. I think that.
And I think there are different pegs you can use to hang the review on, because it's not necessarily the speakership. You've got so many things coming up that are challenging the House, including restoration and renewal, which is going to be quite a massive challenge that could be the basis on which you have this review.
Dr. Fox, the last word.
I agree with Hannah. I think it is a difficult task, and it might be therefore worth thinking about whether whatever committee or review group is established, if one indeed is, whether there would be value in having 3 or 4 independent appointments to it, to provide test, challenge to sort of established thinking, vested interests, but also to bring some expertise in the required areas in terms of external input.
Well, you've all been loquacious and given us much food for thought. And if no member of this committee has altered their views as a result of this morning's then they can't have been listening, but we've been listening very carefully, and I'm very grateful to you. Order, order.
Ended. The proceeding has ended.